Dear colleague professors and researchers, it has been 32 years since the vortex of revolution struck Eastern Europe in 1989. In addition, more than 10 years have passed since Eastern European countries, which had undergone such a systemic transition to liberal democracy, returned to Europe. Following our establishment in 1990, our institute has been conducting endless researches on the Eastern European society, culture, and art. It's no exaggeration to say that it's the only upper-level institution in Korea specialized in the field of Eastern European humanities. To analyze and evaluate these two major recent events, the revolution and the return to Europe, our institute has been working since 2019 on a long-term project with the support of the National Research Foundation of Korea. In December last year and June this year, we already organized two international conferences related to the transition of Eastern Europe from communism to democracy and the integration of Eastern European countries to the European Union. Through these two events, the participants shared information and researched on the historical significance of the transition to Eastern Europe. And now, we prepared the third international conference related to this project. As the last conference, it will also be held online. The topic of today's conference is cultural changes and transition in post-communist Eastern Europe, production and consumption of popular art. Popular art, like history and politics, will be a standard for observing the changes in Eastern Europe. The interdisciplinary approach of the humanities and the social sciences will stimulate profound thinking and various research results. In addition, through complementary studies, it will bring great effect to understand the transition and integration of Eastern Europe. If today's conference means the end of the first stage research called PAST, the next conference will lead the first research on future. That's the return to Europe. I believe that all presentations in each session will enrich our knowledge and provide many implications for scholars studying Eastern Europe. Thank you.
Distinguished professors and dear colleagues, our association and the Institute, which have been conducting various humanities studies on Eastern Europe for the past 30 years, held two international conferences on the process and result of the transformation of the region during the past 2 years. The main titles of the two conferences were respectively Reinterpretation of the Transformation and Transition of Eastern Europe and Transitions and Social Movements in Eastern Europe since the end of the 20th century, Memories and Accountability. As you can see from the titles, the direction of the conference topics started from an overall understanding of the transformation and moved to a research into social change as a result. The title for the third conference, the last of the series, have been decided on cultural change and transition in post-communist Eastern Europe, production and consumption of popular art. Popular art reflects the general sentiments of the public in a society, and in general tends to reinforce uncontroversial beliefs and to create identity in a social group. Thus, it is also closely related to the economic level and everyday values of the current generation. In the sense, Understanding the flow or trend change of popular art in East European countries can be a practical evidence that shows how the 30-year social transformation has settled into the daily lives of ordinary people in the region. I am greatly honored to give congratulatory remarks for today's conference. I would like to express my deep gratitude to Professor Hun KIM, the director of the Institute, and to all participants. Without their hard work and passion, in the situation of this pandemic, the conference would not be possible. Thank you.
Models of production and consumption of popular culture in post-socialist transition. For the purposes of this consideration, a distinction should be made between popular culture, popular art, and pop art. Popular culture consists of the contents of the mass media, primarily of an entertaining and recreational nature, followed by fashion, decoration, and brands, but in a broader sense, it also includes the ways of spending free time and lifestyles. High fashion, expensive and exclusive brands, and exotic tourist destinations were practically inaccessible to the population in the European socialist countries, while other factors of popular culture were available to a more or less limited extent. In the socialist countries of Eastern and Southeastern Europe, popular art was most prevalent. Feature and cartoon, fiction and comics, as well as a wide range of popular music genres, from operettas to folk music. In this regard, it is important to emphasize that European socialist countries had their own production of popular art, which, with some exemptions, has been developing intensively since the late 1950s. Unlike popular, pop art is an author's creation, and it usually has a progressive, avant-garde or underground character. Pop art is most often an engaged art, but in a subversive way, which is why it has met with covert or overt rejection by representatives of the dominant or official culture, both in capitalism and socialism. At the most general level, we can distinguish basic dichotomous models of culture which reflect consumption and lifestyle. In capitalist societies, they are the dominant and countercultural model, and in socialist societies, they are the official and dissident model. Among these models, there is a wide range of subcultures in capitalist societies and an informal culture in socialist ones. The dominant culture of the most developed capitalist countries is not homogeneous. Its taste and consumer habits are shaped by the economic and political establishment, elite creators and intellectuals, but also successful people in the field of sport, entertainment, and show business. The spectrum of the official cultural model in socialism is even wider. It is determined by politicians and directors of companies and institutions who are in ideology mostly dogmatically and in culture mostly enlightenedly oriented. There are also elite creators and intellectuals, as in capitalism, who are sometimes allowed to criticize certain phenomena of socialism, but without questioning the system itself. Then the workers, who were supposed to be the main bearers of culture, but Lenin's idea of proletarian culture, so-called prolet cult, never came to life. There are finally the peasants, whose traditional creativity and naive art are also recognized as part of official culture. This cultural model is characteristic of the countries of Eastern Europe after Stalin's rule, as well as of socialist Yugoslavia somewhat earlier. These were countries with a one-party political system and a planned economy, but also with developed market relations and trade. The main problem was the lack of democracy, especially individual rights and freedoms. The model of official culture in socialism was in fact an ideological projection, while in reality there was a social restructuring characteristic for middle developed industrial countries. It means professional and class differentiation is more pronounced. It means that professional and class differentiation is more pronounced, and the gray zone between official and dissident culture, the gray zone of informal culture, takes clear subcultural outlines by time. Moreover, dissident culture is no longer viewed homogeneously. Deviations from dogmatic educational and recognized elite culture are beginning to be treated as an alternative culture, and sanctions for such were mild or even non-existent. All in all, since the 1960s, the standard of living in the Soviet Union is no longer measured by tons of steel produced, but by the amount of consumer goods. In general, the quality of these goods in most socialist countries was significantly lower than in the developed countries of the West, but the consumer way of life is becoming an increasingly pronounced trend. In the so-called countries of real socialism, citizens strive for car ownership and tourist travel, more diverse ways of spending free time, and consumer goods that could also be used to profile lifestyles. This aspiration, however, often led to the glorification of certain articles, the possession of which was perceived as to be or not to be. One of the most striking examples was jeans, which for decades was considered as a status symbol even in socialist Yugoslavia, although its citizens could travel to most Western European countries. A similar case is with popular culture and art. It also existed in Eastern European countries, primarily due to the rapid expansion of mass media at the beginning of the 20th century, but also the relative development of the cultural industry in some countries before joining the socialist bloc, for example in Hungary and Czechoslovakia. What was missing, however, was the continuous development of capitalist industrial production, which enabled the emergence and expansion of mass society. Mass society, for its part, profiled new standards of leisure and entertainment and directed all capitalist development towards a consumer society. Popular music and various products of popular art, and above all, feature films, fiction, and TV series, were also present in the Eastern Bloc countries. Audiences could watch some American series, such as Roots, about a young African who was taken into slavery in America, but could not watch Dallas or Dynasty. Understandably, because Roots is at the same time a depiction of the drastic exploitation of early liberal capitalism, and as such, this mini-series from the second half of the 1970s is a critique of the very roots of American society, so it is suitable for broadcasting in socialist countries. But Dallas or Dynasty are an explicit depiction of the exclusive lifestyles of Americans, and as such, this series could have a counter effect, meaning less aware citizens of socialism could envy the main characters and feel resistance against their more than modest everyday life. The resistance in the sense as John Fiske put it. The fall of the Berlin Wall at the same time brought a complete and indiscriminate exposure of Eastern European countries to post-industrial consumer culture, And in the segment of the cultural and entertainment industry, the transition was the earliest and fastest. Developed competitive capitalism has practically wiped out the results of socialist cultural policy, and the only thing left for post-socialist states is to protect cultural goods and manifestations of national importance with subsequent regulations, primarily the film industry, art institutions and festivals, some publishing houses, and literary awards. At the same time, it was a period of unpleasant awakening for many artists and performers in socialism, because they were not ready for serious competition, and once gained success and popularity, they could preserve much easier than their colleagues in the West. The Berlin Wall, symbolically speaking, not only limited, it also protected the positions of artists, especially those whose work did not question the basic principle of the ruling socialist ideology. This was basically true for popular art as well, with the difference that creators and performers of different genres of popular music, from folk to avant-garde rock, already acted in competition under socialism, so they adapted more easily to market conditions. Not only, but because of that also, some of them managed to gain popularity in the West even under socialism, such as the Soviet singer and songwriter Bulut Okudžava, the Hungarian rock band Omega, or the Yugoslav rock musician and composer Goran Bregović. The transition, however, introduced double competition in the former socialist states of Eastern and Southeastern Europe. External one, with the Western creators, and internal between artists and performers of the same country. Censorship was also a problem faced by creators in former socialist countries. Only a self-censorship has lost its significance as a relatively successful means of ideological control in socialism, while post-socialist states have retained censorship as an instrument of cultural policy. Thus, for example, in the early 1990s, two very popular music genres were banned from being performed and broadcast in Croatia. It was newly composed folk music and turbo folk, because they were considered Serbian music and therefore dangerous to Croatian culture and even sovereignty. In other post-socialist countries, nationalist ideology also influenced the restriction of creative freedom, and religion joined it. Although declaratively secular, post-socialist societies have rediscovered their collective identity, also in the religion of their ancestors, which is why traditional or national churches have regained their importance and influence. This is especially the case in Russia and Serbia, where autocephalous Orthodox churches do not tolerate artistic criticism of religion and launch moral panic campaigns, similar to those that were once launched in the United Kingdom over the behavior of members of youth subcultures. Last but not least, the transition should result in the acceptance of the standard of political correctness, which, however, can also be a source of restrictions on creative freedoms in all kinds of arts and artistic production. At the end, is there anything left today in popular culture from time of socialism? And the answer is yes. Remained the practice of privileged creators and performers, those who, like the privileged media, are close to the political top.
Dear colleague, I'd like to thank for the invitation to participate in this conference. After the World War II, the international book fairs and especially expositions of books for children were of particular interest as a possible field of reconciliation and cultural exchange. In the West, international corporations were established and international collections of children's literature started being created. In the so-called Eastern Bloc, the book production and circulation became a state monopoly. After the fall of the Berlin Wall and the change of political governance in our country, the state monopoly was abolished and the market was liberalized. The Bulgarian artists of children's book and of the book in general found themselves in an entirely market-driven situation in the wide world. The books for children and adolescents were one of the doors to a wider world for Bulgarian artists at the turn of the 50s and 60s. The wide world here in the title has multiple meanings. On one hand, the fairy tales about different times and peoples and about adventures in near and far worlds broadened the horizons of imagination and gave grounds for the image partnerships in the book to evade the ideological limitations which were valid for other types of art. On the other hand, the children's book from Bulgaria could travel and appear on bookshelves together with books created in the wider world. Books artists could travel too. In the 60s, they participated in book fairs in Leipzig, Bratislava, Bologna, Frankfurt, and elsewhere. At the beginning of the communist rule, private publishing houses were closed down. Instead of them, new state-owned publishing houses were founded. The management of their activity, including book distribution at home and abroad, was centralized. Book publishing became a state monopoly. At the beginning of the communist rule, the attention paid by the authorities to book design and illustration, and in particular to the children's book, was also manifested in the opening of the separate department in book design and illustration in 1953 at the Fine Arts Academy in Sofia. Issues connected with book publishing were often discussed following the party decrees, but also following the public interest in them, on the pages of Искусство, the only art magazine at the time. At the beginning of the 60s, Children's Book and Arts Week was established, and it involved manifestations in the performing arts, cinema, music, etc. State prizes were awarded too. The book was undoubtedly of paramount importance for the demonstration of the successes of the communist rule in the field of culture and education. However, despite the stated effort, Bulgaria's participations in the international book fairs were reported as unsatisfactory. The main reason was the poor quality of the materials and the print. In an article on the exposition in 1965, Vasil Yonchev, a specialist in book design, cautiously yet definitely stated that while the graphic works showed that the aesthetic view, I quote, and the graphic language of the artists from different countries radically differ, the graphic language of book artists from all these countries is sharing more and more points of contact. In other words, the quality and standards in book design cannot be split into capitalist and communist. In all positive examples, the quality of the print supports the skill and talent of the book artist. Bulgarian books, I quote again, still look greyish and seem faded, even if they are interesting as a graphic design. In 1968, the first national exhibition of book illustration and art was opened in Sofia. The same year, 1968, known for the Prague Spring and the student unrest in Paris and elsewhere in Europe, the first international exhibition / book fair was held in Sofia in October. More than 200 publishers from socialist countries and just as many from other countries were publicized in the media. Bulgaria participated in the Children's Book Fair in Bologna. It was the biggest among all specialized international forums for children's book. In an interview with the Bulgarian participants in the edition of the fair in the same 1968, they assessed their presentation as very successful, but as usual the Bulgarian participants did not manage to sign contracts with foreign publishing houses because of the poor quality of printing in Bulgaria. The book fair in Bologna also had an illustration section where artists exhibited original works. On another international forum, the Illustration Biennale in Bratislava, in the exhibition of original illustrations, the difficulties with the polygraph realization of illustrations in Bulgaria seem to have disappeared. Experience has proved that Bulgaria had illustrators of a high level. For the artist generation of the 60s in Bulgaria, the partnership with the text consisted, first of all, of the interpretation of the literary text in images. What was analyzed was the connection and discrepancies between text and image, the image as a visual interpretation of the text, and sometimes the artistic superiority of the illustrations in comparison with literature. At the same time, their presentation in exhibitions suggests that illustration is an art that can have an impact outside the book too. In the article entitled Illustration in Encyclopedia Universalis, Ségolène Leman reminds us that the issue of text and image was of great interest in semiotics at the time. She defines illustrations as being of the same essence as children's books, recalling Alice's famous question from Alice in Wonderland. The question was before falling asleep over a long text, and I quote, "What is the use of book without pictures and conversation?" End of quotes. As for the illustrations displayed in separate artworks outside the book, however, from the position of the children's audience, we can add, I quote, "What is the use of illustrations in the exhibition halls without narratives and fairy tales?" The artists in communist Bulgaria shared their observations on the division of children's illustrated books in the West into books with large circulation numbers, which were supposed to meet the mass market expectations, and luxury editions of books with limited circulation. Such a differentiation of the market was unfamiliar in Bulgaria at the time, when the official ideology proclaims equal access to culture in general and to books and rejects luxury. However, the contradiction was evident in artistic terms. The book is a special type of artifact, but unlike other artifacts, painting, graphic arts, sculpture, etc., whose contacts with the market were deleted and transformed by the centralized management during the communist rule, the market aspect of the book is irrevocable. Looking at the international book forums, we notice that during the communist period, the word exhibition was part of the name of the international forum in Moscow, for instance. Today, the same forum is called Moscow Book Fair. The forum in Frankfurt, revived in 1949, was still named Fair, Frankfurter Buchmesse. In Sofia in 1968, when the first international exhibition/fair of the book was held, the two words exhibition and fair were combined as a compromise. It is obvious that the word fair confused the ideologists of communism as it revealed the commercial aspect of the international forums. Book fairs were expected to boost the book industry. How can those forums be assessed in case where commercial results were lacking? After the fall of the Berlin Wall and the liberalization of the market, the art of the children's book and of the book in general found itself in a situation in which production and distribution were no longer planned but market-driven. The interconnection of the cost of the book as a product and the purchasing power of the readers becomes evident. In a series of financial crises in Bulgaria in the 90s, the newly established private publishers faced a number of difficulties, among them the high value-added tax on books. Some publishing houses did not survive. In terms of form and style, Bulgarian artists during the 60s and later on had different preferences and skills: painting and drawing, graphic print, or its imitation, references to children's drawing, etc., etc. These characteristics of the illustration of children's books in Bulgaria from the time of communism are the reason behind our interest today. In the 90s, computer-aided design came into print production. Book artists found themselves in a new technological situation where artistic skills were in competition with digitally generated images in terms of production value. The price of the final book product is decisive. The light and dark sides of this dynamic liberal market situation are visible on the bookshelves in bookshops and libraries. A few appealing and expensive children's books illustrated and designed by Bulgarian or foreign artists in books by foreign writers, and a multitude of cheaper books with large circulations and poor artistic quality. As for the participation of Bulgarian book artists in a wider world, difficulties now of a different nature still exist. The obstacles to selling Bulgarian books outside the country are now due to the strong market competition. The barriers posed by our small language is still valid. The library of Bulgarian children's literature of supranational interest is ever so relatively small. A large part of the successfully illustrated and designed children's books in Bulgaria, as before, are translated from foreign languages, although they are now incomparably more numerous and more varied in character as well as in literary qualities than at the time of the state monopoly. In the liberalized market situation, and especially with Bulgaria's accession to the European Union, more artists are working for international corporations, realizing their skills and talent in international publications. Such examples are Yasen Gyuzelev, Milena Radeva, Kapka Kaneva, Yasen Grigorov, and others. As risky as it is to generalize in the dynamics of the last 2 decades, it seems that the international market offer are mainly projects by Bulgarian artists for children's book design and illustration realized by foreign and international publishers. And yet, there have been happy achievements in the visual images of Bulgarian children's books with a wide variety of styles and forms and proficiency in digital tools in the last decades. Most often, these are small circulation boutique editions by few publishers in the country, such as Jeanette 45 and List. Some of these books, object books, space books, etc., are authors' editions financed by the artists themselves. Among the artists, to mention at least a few names, are Toni Goranova, Victor Păunov, Yana Leviev, Penko Gelev, Mian Damjanov, etc. The division between the mass market of inexpensive children's books and expensive editions with limited circulation has become familiar in our country, just as it was in the wide world. Thank you for your attention.
Hello, my name is Emma Pedestru. I'm a PhD candidate at the Babeș-Bolyai University in Cluj with a thesis about Romanian theatre criticism during the communist era. For this conference, I have chosen to talk about attempts to rebrand Romanian theatre after the fall of communism, as seen through the eyes of some of the drama critics of the time. To begin with, I would like to make a contextualization about the way theatre was perceived and experienced by its public during those times. First of all, as many people know, the last decade before the fall of the Iron Curtain was the toughest Romanians lived through in recent history. They were hungry, they were cold, they had to wait in endless lines to get scraps of food, they had to play pretend while taking part in the celebrations of Nicolae Ceausescu and his wife. Therefore, when thinking about other unaffiliated artistic endeavors of those times, one might ask how they were even possible with such an exhausted audience. Yet Romanian theatre maintained a certain prestige rather 1980s, resulting mostly from the short-lived liberalization of the 60s. And it also managed to keep some of its public. After the July thesis of 1971, creating valuable performances have become a strenuous task for theatre makers, as most of them were faced with the choice to either leave the country or find ways to evade censorship, which often meant making compromises both aesthetically and ideologically. Also, while going through his phase of narcissistic self-adulation, Ceausescu, even though he relied on all art forms to build an image of him that was both heroic and paternal, both authoritative and benevolent, he also feared the subversive potency of artistic endeavors. This bipolarity of his, along with the economical woes and the dictator's retrenching policy, led to all sorts of draconic measures, leaving cultural establishments to mostly fend for themselves. In the 1980s, theaters, for example, had to self-finance about 80% of their productions, which in a capitalist society might not seem peculiar or unreasonable. But in those times of extreme poverty, as they were struggling to attract viewers willing to suffer a great discomfort just to attend some heavily censored shows, theatre creators had to find innovative ways to survive. Some of them resorted to recycling props from one play to another, but some started manufacturing all sorts of products in theatre workshop and later sold them in the streets. They would sell coffins, wooden coffins, wedding dresses. This way, they afforded to stage productions that sometimes eluded the censor's capacity of semiotic decryption. This, of course, was a phenomenon of cultural resistance, which nowadays is very much debated in Romania, because it is viewed retrospectively as a form of escapism rather than as a combative venture or as dissidence. However, during those times, cultural resistance was a great comfort to many people. Some of them attended the theatre in the hope that they would manage to capture any kind of elusive gestures or lines that could have hinted to their situation, thus feeling like they were taking part in an act of defiance. directors who were oppressed or harassed by the huge censorship apparatus of the regime gained popularity and for a while managed to attract quite large numbers of theater goers. People would stand in line just to buy tickets to their shows. But these mocking references to the Communist Party, the so-called lizards, were not limited to the great performances of the decade. Sometimes even the most unremarkable shows were packed with hidden meanings and clues that challenged the spectator to become a sort of detective and decipher them. Critics of the time never mentioned such transgressions, but we can find more about this particular side of history by reading later accounts and anecdotes, like Victor Scoradec's introduction to Andrei Șerban's Night of the Kings, in which he recounts a fragment of another otherwise unremarkable staging of the Twelfth Night from 1984, in which the clown, played at the time by an actor, by the actor Mihai Mălai Mare, was preparing to speak as he was making his entrance onto the stage, but changed his mind at the last moment and started searching the set for hidden microphones. Some spectators, of course, started applauding. Even though at first, says Coradec, they were looking left and right to make sure no one was looking at them. Then, as a confirmation of their fears, the clown started pointing fingers at the so-called sinners and taking notes in an imaginary notebook. So these were the sort of the so-called lizards, the sort of things that clarify why contemporary audiences and researchers why theater survived in such a and how theater survived in such a hostile environment, managing to maintain its relevance despite everyday ordeals. After 1989, the events that followed the anti-communist revolution shook all cultural establishments to the core, and most noticeably, they left theater without its main purpose, to entertain the illusion of non-compliance. The public wasn't that interested in theater anymore, and theater makers and critics experienced certain resentment towards the playwrights of the last decades, and they're now seen as obsolete works. Some of those authors sought refuge in institutions as managers, while others gradually withdrew from public life. There were, however, a few that decided to fight back, going as far as to create a group of outcasts under the name of Dragon. In Romanian, it's an acronym derived from the phrase dramaturgi goniți, banished playwrights. However, almost none of the dramatic writers who rose to stardom, to a semblance of stardom under Ceausescu's protectorate, managed to find a place in this newly created cultural market. It is fascinating that critics started after 1990, almost immediately after the revolution actually, to decry the irrelevance, the complete irrelevance of Romanian dramaturgy for the newfound society, for the newborn democratic society. The critics were caught in the swirl of change that was affecting the whole theatrical community and on a larger scale Romanian society. Romanians in that period were fascinated with the West, with everything that came from the outside. So theater makers, theater people were waiting a messianic intervention that would save Romanian theater and regain its relevance and help regain its relevance. And this salvation came in the form of the return of the so-called return of the prodigal sons, which was in fact the repatriation of those theater directors who had left the country at the height of Ceausescu's power. They came back to the country after having gained celebrity while overseas. Lucian Pintilie, Radu Penciulescu, David Esrig, Liviu Ciulei, Vlad Muguros the younger, Andrei Șerban had in the eyes of the public and the critics a sort of magical aura that enabled them to completely transfigure what was left of Romanian theatre. The last three, Ciulei, Mugur and Șerban, along with Alexander Hausvater, who was only a child when his family left for Israel, staged a series of performances at the beginning of the 1990s that are documented in later Romanian spectacological studies as the genesis of contemporary theatre in this country. Because of lack of space, but also because it's quite relevant and interesting, I have chosen Andrei Șerban as a case study. In 1990, Andrei Șerban stepped in as manager of the National Theatre in Bucharest at the invitation of the Minister of Culture, Andrei Pleșu. And most people expected some sort of miraculous change. While they were mesmerized by the magnitude of the performances he created during his directorship, they were also left rather puzzled by his departure, which happened less than 3 years later. Despite initial excitement and anticipation, the director could not find his place in the Romanian society. First of all, not everyone was open to change. Some of the actors and the theater staff were complaining about his management. The actors were dissatisfied with having to work 8 hours a day. But secondly, Șerban himself proved to be quite intolerant to criticism, as demonstrated by a press conference held after his premiere with The Cherry Orchid in 1992, during which he publicly questioned critics' right to comment on his work, seeing as they had collaborated with Ceausescu's security. This, of course, was the result of a not so enthusiastic reception of his latest work. Valentin Silvestru, one of the most prominent theatre critics during the socialist decades, had disapprovingly commented on what he called Șerban's belief that any artistic mirroring of topical matters had to be accompanied by some sort of vulgarity, which in his eyes diminished the overall impact of the director's plays. Also, the reviewer had called the performance partly inauthentic, said it lacked sentiment, and he described it as being done proficiently but uninterestingly. However, back in 1990, Șerban's famous staging of an antique trilogy had stirred much stronger reactions from all ranges of axiological beliefs. However, most of them were passionate and deeply emotional. After the critics had an initial hesitation due to it being a remake. Șerban had first staged the Greek trilogy for the Manhattan La Mama Theatre back in the 70s. But after this initial hesitation, critics and the public embraced the performance of a theatrical event with transformative value. The reviews of Victor Scoradeț and Alice Georgescu to the trilogy are an interesting read. They're strikingly similar. They have strikingly similar styles, but they describe complete opposite reactions to the same elements of the show, or shows, as they were actually three plays: Medea, Electra, and the Trojan Women reunited under the same title. Both authors chose to write detailed reportages of the encounter with Șerban's creation rather than critical analysis of the performance. The former even acknowledged he did not consider the staging as appropriate for semiotic interpretation. However, while Scoradeț became completely enthralled with the innovative use of space and the violently sensorial particularities of the acting, Georgescu admitted to feeling rather confused, if not even annoyed, by the mise-en-scène. While Scoradeț appreciated the unintelligible nature of the text, as it was all spoken in a mixture of languages, thinking of it as transgressive, Georgescu compared it to the babbling of the communist authorities in a wooden language that inevitably ended up sounding foreign to the listeners. And she even accused Șerban of failing to understand the importance of meaningful words for the Romanian public. Nonetheless, Andrei Șerban was one of the few theatre makers who managed to bring said public back to the auditoriums after the Romanian Revolution. When he directed The Night of Kings, at the same time as Liviu Ciulei directed A Midsummer Night's Dream, the press spoke of a symbolic meeting of two artistic spirits who happened to work in the same place at the same time in Bucharest, towards a greater purpose. In most articles, the performances and their directors were discussed as a duopoly. This proves that beyond the individual significance of each prodigal son, they were all part of a larger game-changing phenomenon. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Hun KIM. I am professor at the Department of Romanian Studies in Hangul University of Foreign Studies. I am very pleased to present this paper in this session, and I would like to inform you that this presentation was prepared together with my colleague Professor Roxana, Cătălina, Anghelescu. The title of presentation is Retrospection of Socialist Romanian Cinema and a New Wave in Transition, and it consists of two main parts. The first is a retrospection of socialist Romanian cinema. In this chapter, we can see how Romanian cinema has changed and developed during the socialist era. And the second chapter introduced the development of Romanian modern cinema after transition as a new wave. Even though it would be great pleasure to read the wallpaper, I have to select and read only some parts directly from article for a necessary understanding. Anyway, all papers can be downloaded from the East European and Balkan Institute website. The beginning of cinema history in Romania is as follows. The first presentation of a motion picture is recorded on May 27, 1896 in Romania, less than 5 months after the performance of Louis and Auguste Lumiere's motion picture at Grand Café, Paris. The early introduction of the motion picture in Romania comes from the influence and the acceptance of French culture in the progress of Romanian modernity in the mid-19th century. Romanian modernization was made almost by the French influence, and even Bucharest itself started to be called the little fairies, being assimilated with the beauty of French culture. France had a strong effect not only on culture but even also on every field like architecture, legal system, scientific technology, etc. The movie staging started to be universalized from 1905 in Bucharest, and especially Bucharest International Exhibition from 1906 served as an important momentum. From 1930, the government formulated its financial support for film production, and therefore the movie industry made remarkable progress and became very popular. But Romania underwent a great social and political change after World War II. Following the resignation of Mihai I, King of Romania, at December 30, 1947, Romania has become a pro-Soviet regime. All of Romania was nationalized from then on, like other communist countries, and all of the power concentrated into the party. The field of art did not make any exception. Therefore, the film industry began to be controlled by monopoly of state, like the other industries, and the movies were forced to be strengthened to the ideology education. The shooting and the distribution of film worked under government control and financial aid, and the film industry in this situation should endure political conditions for its survival. In spite of limitation of choice, production of film increased every year, and documentary films grew in geometrical progression. The only movie in socialist age was forced to be the role of delivering an ideological message, but not all of them were degraded to the means of propaganda, and a dim tradition of pure art was barely maintained. In keeping with Lenin's teachings, for the social formation of the proletariat, not as a fine art, but as an instrument of ideology, the newly established regime began to support the production of propaganda films. The Soviet Zhdanovism, based on the three spirit or essence of the Communist Party spirit, the people's spirit, and the ideological spirit, which Zhdanov recalled, stipulated the practical obligation of art media. Early movies based on this doctrine presented a rough blueprint that would dominate communist cinema in Romania and Eastern Europe until the collapse of the regime in 1989. In spite of the Cold War system and censorship, some Romanian movies received worldwide attention, and by for artistic favor and the transcendence of ideology, some like Liviu Ciulai's The Forest of the Hanged, in Romanian, Pădurea Spânzuraților, Mircea Mureșan's Blazing Winter, in Romanian, Răscoală, and Ion Popescu Copo's animation, Short Story, in Romanian, Scurtă Istorie, etc., were awarded in various film festivals. Romanian filmmakers in socialist days had to seek measures to escape from ideological problems in numerous instances. One among the solutions was to make a movie based on the play or novel of famous writers, such as Ion Căcăragiale, Liviu Leopoldanu, Ioan Slavici, Marin Preda, etc. And the other solution was the historical film built on historic contents like important event in Romanian history, inspiration of national consciousness and patriotism, and the chronicle of heroes and heroes like Mia Vitez, Stefan Chelmare, Vlad Tepes. In this era, when movies were based on pure art, literature, and historical events, a minority of film directors tried to realize their artistic world on screen, facing the danger of censorship. Many movies failed, of course, to face the censorship, and thus censorship banned continually daring movies. But pure art, literature, and history films, being free of censorship, took the lead in the Romanian cinema. Some young moviemen at that time, who were placed on control under the communist system, finally decided to leave the country and exile, and only after transition they could return to Romania. The 1989 revolution was an important event that evoked freedom in culture and art in the collapse of the dictatorship and the return to liberal democracy. With the beginning of the 1990s, the raw filming method containing various aspects and images of the revolution had an influence on documentaries, domestic and foreign documentary fiction, and feature and short films. This effect traced the trajectory of the first decade of the 21st century that gave birth to the emergence of the Romanian New Wave. The film, which captures the social and political atmosphere during the 10 years of transition, has become a barometer for the historical settlement of the socialist past and the recollection of transition. Within the changing landscape of the 1990s, based on discernible nativist and Western influence, the directors of that time, who were not well known in the early 90s, did creative activities in 4 categories introduced by Nesta. First, films still indebted to a metaphoric encoded cinematic language. Second, films that immediately and straightforwardly expressed and exposed the reality of Romania after post-communism. Third, films that trace long unknown forbidden events or histories from recent Romanian history, such as the horrific ordeal of communist prison or forced collectivization to displace private property. And the rest, films depicting the complex facts of the December Revolution and its consequences in a documentary and television approach style. Although Ion Iliescu's new government was established after the revolution of 1989, students and intellectuals demonstrated extensively against the government during 53 days in 1990 in the University of Bucharest Square, because there still exists a remnant of socialist dictatorship. Thereupon, the government set up counterfire with the government patronized demonstration by mine workers. Iliescu's government denied this over-blocking, but Stere Gulea, film director, accused the government of crimes while making the movie The University Scare. This film was highly evaluated as a documentary film and noticed the resurgence for neo-realism film. The new trend of documentary based on the authorism film became popular after transition. The situation of the 90s was extremely difficult for Romanian cinema, being in a border area. However, being awarded at international film festivals, two Romanian films of the 90s started to attract the world attention. Dan Pizza received in 1992 the Silver Lion for Luxury Hotel, an overwhelming allegory of the communist utopia, while Lucian Pintillier received in 1998 the Jury Award for Next Stop Paradise, an atrocious drama of post-communist disappointment. In addition to the directors mentioned above, director Nail Karanpil, who connects the old and the new generation, made his splendid comedy like Aspaldo Tango and Philanthropica. Between the old wave, also called the 1970s generation, represented by Pintillier, Daneliu, Pizza, etc., and the new wave generation after 2000, the filmmakers of the Karanpil's generation, influenced by director Karanpil, will play the role of intermediary. Due to economic difficulties and the disorganization of the system, it took almost a decade for the National Film Center to become nearly functional. The reduced film budget and the constant devaluation of the currency in the 1990s did not allow to make any normal film in Romania. However, thanks to the governmental concern and support, young filmmakers' talented aptitude and own effort, Romanian cinema inaugurated the new Renaissance at the beginning of the 21st century. Young filmmakers who debuted after 2000 led dramatically the development of Romanian cinema and registered a great success abroad with the audience as well with the juries of international festivals. Cătălin Mitulescu's short-length film Traffic, Cristi Puiu's The Death of Mr. Lazarescu, in Romanian, Moartea domnului Lazarescu, and Corneliu Porumboiu's 12-8 East of Bucharest, in Romanian, A fost sau n-a fost, were honored in various international film festivals. These results showed marked improvement in 2007. A young director, Cristian Mungiu, received Palme d'Or at Cannes under the international spotlight with his movie 4 months, 3 weeks and 2 days, in Romanian, 4 luni, 3 săptămâni și 2 zile. Puiu planted the seed, Porumboiu watered, and Mungiu picked the fruit. Moreover, the late Cristian Remescu, who passed away by car crash, was awarded Uncertain Regard for California Dreaming, and Florin Șerban won a Silver Bear at Berlin in 2010 for If I Want to Whistle, I Whistle, in Romanian, Eu când vreau să fluier, fluier. As a recent topic in the film world, Romanian cinema during the last 10 years, with the beginning of the 21st century, showed two directions of tendency, like shooting based on the authorism film and shooting which experiment diversity and the possibility of opening the door for future movies. The former, produced by young directors, created a great sensation, being grafted the minimalism and the neorealism as realism without borders. The movies in and around Puiu, Porumboiu, and Mungiu emerged as a key figure in the film world, being a hit with critics in the domestic and the international festivals, and they made Romanian cinema, which was located in the border, to become a new rising country of cinema. The latter, as a movie which experimented diversity and possibility behind the purity and based on the art for art principle, tried to overcome the limitation of subject and the author and film director's tendency. Among them, Nemescu's California Dreamings is a notable example. Romanian New Wave, supported by young filmmakers, regardless of the former and the latter, showed us the other potentiality of how the future of the Romanian movie evolves. Thank you very much. This concludes the presentation. For the detailed contents, please check the paper in EEBS website. I hope that this presentation has been helpful to your academic curiosity. Thank you very much for your attention.
Dear conference, thank you for inviting me and welcome you all. The cultural history of the post-socialist transitions in Eastern Europe is usually seen from the perspective of high culture. The reason for this position is not only the elitist attitude of the intellectuals and the political cultural sector in the region, but also the fact that high art is traditionally seen as a prime source that can reveal the nature of socialism. But with the end of socialism and the abolition of censorship, the advent of liberty and liberal democracy, but also the cruelty of the free market and the closure of a world characterized by the priority of high art is usually associated. This presentation steps out from this classical approach, and it doesn't really seek to invalidate this perspective. My starting position and hypotheses are that with the help of the study of popular culture in the region, we can gain new important and relevant knowledge, not only about socialism, but also about the post-socialist transition. I also think that it is important to stress that I do not want to think in terms of binary oppositions that contrast high-end popular culture and socialist and post-socialist culture. I will argue instead that competition and market values were also present during socialism and in social cultural production and played an important role in Hungarian film culture before the political changes. Furthermore, the logic of high art and state support has not disappeared at all in the post-socialist period. So based on these arguments, I will try to show that while the years of the political changes undoubtedly mark a turning point, the interesting and complex dynamics of the transition can only be understood from a multifaceted perspective. So I will try to illustrate this statement or argument with a few examples from the field of Hungarian film culture, and in particular the transformation of the, or focus on the production and distribution exhibition scene. So I will try to show that popular culture was not a winner of the transition, and still, I will argue that by examining trends in popular culture, we can build a complex and exciting picture of the dynamics of Eastern European political changes. So I will try to develop a couple of hypotheses, namely three. Questioning trends and questions of the transition. First, the Hungarian film industry and film culture of late socialist period was in many ways more market-oriented than the early post-socialist years. Second hypothesis, in the transformation of the Hungarian film culture during the political changes, the field of drastic change was not production, but distribution and exhibition, thus socialist film culture, ended in the cinemas. And third, the period of political changes was not a juncture or end point in the stylistic, generic, and thematic trends of Hungarian films. Thus, continuity is more important than rupture and discontinuity. So I will try to focus with the help of these hypotheses on the questions of directions and ambivalent dynamics. So I will begin with the first hypothesis. Hungarian film production has operated under a centralized and hierarchical system during the 4 decades of state socialist film production. Popular film culture was present through this whole period. But until the early 70s, Hungarian entertainment film culture was dominated and defined by a generation of filmmakers who had started their careers before the Second World War during the peak period of Hungarian entertainment cinema. The great transformations of the 70s were all losses of one kind or another. First of all, the rapid loss of audience of Hungarian films in the cinemas. Second, the loss of political interest of Hungarian films. And third, the disappearance of that great generation of the directors of popular comedies. So all this made the 70s a dominant period for Hungarian art and so-called author films, and pushed the popular films in the background. So this brings us into the 80s and the early 80s, which brought major changes with a new shift in the position and role of entertainment films and popular cinema. Back on film industry. In Hungary, from the 60s until almost today, an average is 20-25 films have been made every year. During the socialist period, all of these films were made under the umbrella of state socialist studio system and with the state funding. It's quite important to note that the Hungarian film factories, revenues and operations were based on 3 main pillars: domestic film production, service jobs for Hungarian television, and service jobs for international feature films. However, so we will arrive back to the 80s, early 80s, during the economic crisis, Hungarian and Eastern European economic crisis. Public support money for Hungarian film production began to decline, and the film industry's other 2 main sources of income, thus service jobs for television and for international productions, also declined, weakened. So studios and filmmakers have reacted to this decline and fall in different ways. First, directors, especially those art house directors, art cinema directors who had contacts and recognition abroad, try to make Western co-productions. One of the most prominent example is István Szabó's Oscar winning Mephisto and his later films from the decade. And the other direction was a turn toward popular films, entertainment cinema. So the crisis in the early 80s started a momentum, a short-term new wave of genre films and popular films, especially crime films and crime comedies, which were made by a new wave and the new generation of Hungarian filmmakers. And it's quite important and intrusive to look at the list of the most successful Hungarian films of the period. I highlighted with orange the feature films, and you can see that half of the most popular films were not feature films. Vuk, the most popular film, was an animation, a family animation. Stephen King was a musical film. Cat City, again, an animation. Water Spider, Wonder Spider, animation. And at the least, among the most popular films, there are 5 feature films, crime comedies, made in the style or a kind of Hungarian version of the popular and famous Piedone Bigfoot crime comedies. So the short-term wave of popular films in the first half of the 80s can be linked to the attempts of economic reforms of the period. That was the time when Hungary joined to the International Monetary Fund, and as for the local markets, the government licensed private enterprises. So that was a kind of turn or marketization. And the film industry was hit by this reform attempt at the middle of the decades. A new management started with the changing the internal accounting system and came into conflict with senior directors and studio executives. This reform would have made film productions even more expensive than before, while the studios complained of a fall in subsidies. So these conflicts had 2 important consequences. One is the liquidation of a new studio of politically engaged filmmakers, and the second is the reorganization of the film studio system, followed by the independence of the studio at the end of the 80s, a year before the political changes. So, in the second half of the 80s, the feature film lobby successfully asserted its interest in the battle for public money, public resources, while one of the results of this was the marginalization of non-mainstream filmmaking. And that time, popular films, which had a momentum at the beginning of the decade, again were pushed into the background because they were regarded as non-mainstream cinema. So at the end of the decade, the Ministry of Culture reallocated funds to film production at the expense of the subsidies of exhibition film theaters. So it can be said that the effort to maintain continuity in film production was tying up increasingly serious resources and had longer-term strategic consequences. So that's why we can say, and that's my second hypothesis, that during the political changes, the field of drastic change was not film production, but distribution and exhibition. Why and how? The artistically enlarged and heavily subsidized network of cinemas during socialism had already weakened long before the political changes. The peak year of local cinema attendance figures was 140 million in 1960 in a 10 million country. But from that point on, in the following decades, the number of viewers, and especially viewers of Hungarian domestic films, steadily declined. And here are the trend line of attendances from the years of political changes. Let's not forget that the decline in theatrical attendance numbers at that time, 80s, was a global phenomenon. And globally, it was more a consequence of the audiovisual revolution of the era, the boom of video culture and satellite television. So the consolidation process of European film industry and film culture, especially what happened in Western Europe, was forced and helped by this spiral in attendance figures. However, the situation in Eastern Europe was particularly dramatic because the countries of the Soviet bloc were simultaneously experiencing a political and the communication / audiovisual regime change. At the beginning of the 80s in Hungary, you had to pay the price of a car for a video recorder. By the end of the decade, on the contrary, you could buy a VHS player for the price of a color TV. Well, actually, it's not, of course, that the black market in low-quality video copies of American Hollywood films, which became widespread in the region in the second half of the decade, was the major factor that blew up the system. I can refer a recent Romanian documentary entitled Chuck Norris versus Communism, How the Video Killed the Red Political Star. However, so that's rather a joke than a clear statement, but video culture played an important role, at least in the changing trends in film consumer behavior. So the fall in the number of cinema goers in Hungary in the 80s fits with international trends in many ways. The lack of money and the loss of audiences led to the earlier mentioned series of restructurings in the industry in the middle of the decades. One element of which was the transformation of the studios into independent companies, and the other, the end of the monopoly of film distribution. In addition to the monopolized distribution company Mocape, new companies and studios were given the right to distribute films independently. American, mostly Hollywood films appeared on the domestic market in large numbers with a huge high number of copies and with strong promotion. One of the early examples was Rain Man. So rapidly, the earlier decades numbers and proportion in release and distribution numbers, which was like 2/3 for Hungarian and socialist films and 1/3 for so-called capitalist or Western films, turned and practically overturned. And actually, if the aim of the change was to boost theatrical revenues, which had to be in a decline in the previous years, this turn was a success as audiences and especially the revenues, thanks to the high ticket prices for Hollywood films, suddenly jumped. So in fact, since the Ministry of Culture was able to use the increased cinema revenues to cut back on the subsidies of the distribution and exhibition market, they could focus on their support on the film production. However, this tactic led to the decline of the Hungarian cinema network shortly. So with the end of socialism, the state withdrew from the direct support and control of the film industry as early as a year after the first democratic parliamentary elections in 1991. A new structure was established based on the consensus of the new political parties and on the representatives and leading organizations of the industry. A new self-governing institution was launched. This institution, the Motion Picture Foundation of Hungary, became the main funding body of Hungarian film culture and industry. This foundation was responsible for the distribution of the annual state support, which was decided by the parliament over the different sectors of the industry. However, this institution focused mainly on the support of film production, and other sectors of the industry became severely underfinanced. Thus, we can say that the transition period of the Hungarian film industry resulted in a strange paradoxical situation. On the one hand, it was rapid and successful, and without any dramatic conflicts in terms of maintaining the continuity of the state support for the industry and in terms of the abolishment of censorship. But on the other hand, the clear winners of the transformation were the film studios, film making, film production, while the losers were the cinema operators, and the main loser was the visibility of Hungarian films, domestic cinema. Because during socialism, cinemas were owned by the state and were operated by the local municipalities. In the early 90s, after the political changes, the vast majority of rural cinemas were closed, sold, or privatized. With the political changes, cinema going became a rural pastime. Became an urban pastime, and with the advent of multiplexes at the end of the 90s, the number of screens in smaller towns and at the country declined. While the capital, Budapest, was proud of its excellent art cinema network for a long time, only a few such venues remained in the countryside. Art cinema and cinema going for Hungarian films became an exclusive urban, Budapest-based pastime after the political changes. And as for the third statement, shortly, the period of political changes was not a turning point in terms of the stylistic, generic and thematic trends of Hungarian films. As we have seen, the political changes and the transition brought fundamental changes in the visibility of Hungarian films. In terms of production, the emergence of private production companies was an important development, but the main beneficiaries of subsidies under the new system were the former socialist state studios. The mainstream of Hungarian filmmakers and the studio elite were able to continue their careers relatively successfully. The fact that fewer and fewer Hungarian films were seen in cinemas, the attendance of Hungarian films in the early 90s was only 1 or 2% of the total audience figures, were seen as a kind of necessarily bad aspect or side effect of the transformation. The consequence of the relatively successful transition was therefore that the main trends in Hungarian filmmaking remained basically unchanged during the period of political change. The focus remained on mainstream art house filmmaking, while popular cinema was relegated again to the background. Hungarian screens were dominated by Hollywood blockbusters. Filmmakers who wanted to make commercially successful productions left the film industry and made commercials instead. This situation only changed in the late 90s with the advent of commercial television, the emergence of a new generation of directors, and with the emergence of a new topic or attitude, that is the wave of post-socialist nostalgia that lured local audiences back to the cinema. So that was my talk on the transformation and changes in Hungarian cinema, and thank you for your attention.
Welcome everyone. As an art historian, or in fact a historian of architecture, I perceive the issues discussed at this conference primarily in the context of interesting phenomena concerning changes in post-socialist urban space and architecture. What is important and interesting here is the role of architectural heritage in strengthening or even recreation of urban identity and social ties after the political transformation of 1989. At the same time, changes caused by the collapse of the communist regime, visible in the social, cultural, political, and economic spheres, have significantly influenced perception of the role and significance of historical structures in a post-socialist city. Their function, as well as cultural and social meaning, are being currently redefined. The changes and associated challenges are well illustrated by the example of Łódź, which is one of the largest Polish cities. In its history, we can identify three major turning points. The first one happened at the beginning of the 19th century, when Łódź obtained the title of an industrial city. It was the beginning of intensive development of the city. A small settlement transformed into a powerful, multicultural, vibrant metropolis, which at the end of the 19th century became one of the largest industrial centers in Europe. It was also then that the character and aesthetics of the city were shaped. Red brick factory buildings still constitute the distinctive heritage of Łódź and give a city unique character on a European scale. The Second World War and introduction of the communist system afterwards was another important turning point in the city history. After 1945, private property was nationalized and taken away from its rightful owners. However, the city's economic development was still based on the textile industry operating in the nationalized factories, and which was still perceived as the city of 100 factories and 100 chimneys. Yet numerous interiors of former factory owners' residences and palaces were devastated and assigned new functions without respect for their historical character and decor. For example, Neo-Renaissance Herbstpalast was used among others as a center for social workers, and its former ballroom was turned into Christmas tree bubble manufacturing facility. Radical ideological and propaganda activities were also undertaken during this period. In the first post-war years, the capital past of Łódź was severely criticized, and the historical role and contribution of the old families of factory owners in the city's development was denied. Their actual significance as the spirituous movements of Łódź development were restored in the public consciousness as a result of actions taken years after the political transformation of 1989, and this process still has some way to go. While the 19th century saw extremely rapid development of Łódź, in the 90s of 20th century, after the transition to a market economy, the city experienced equally dynamic industrial decline. This period completely undermined the basis of the city functioning. It is a peculiar paradox of history that a positive political, social and cultural change turned out to be an extremely difficult experience for Łódź, its economic life and architectural heritage. Putting numerous factories into liquidation threatened the existence of buildings and entire post-factory complexes inseparably from the urban landscape. In the second half of the 90s, Łódź had several million square meters of space to let in post-factory buildings. So it became necessary to find new functions for them, which was a significant challenge due to the scale of the phenomenon. The fall of the communists in 1989 was an important turning point in the political context, but it also introduced changes and initiated processes that significantly influenced architecture and urban planning, as well as a way of thinking about the city in a broader social and cultural context. After the collapse of the centralized communist system, the narrative about Łódź was radically transformed. The system of forces influencing and affecting the city's shape became more complex and complicated. In a democratic system, a city is no longer a fully planned and controlled zone. Changes resulting from processes such as democratization, marketization, or globalization have significantly differentiated and diversified transformation of the city and its architecture, introducing new players into the activities undertaken in urban space. The political transformation and new globalized conditions resulted not only in revision of the concepts concerning economic functioning of Łódź, but also in the need to promote the city and create its clear and positive image, which would bring both social and economic benefits. An important role in this process is played by architecture and urban planning. Former negative associations related to the industrial character of Łódź, such as pollution, unemployment, or the lack of cultural references and roots beyond the 19th century, are being replaced by positive connotations based largely on the values of the unique post-industrial 19th century architecture and entrepreneurship of its owners. Appropriate policy and activities concerning Łódź architecture and urban planning as the most external and immediately noticeable signs of changes are to help break the former negative image of heavily polluted, neglected workers' city. At the beginning of 90s, the greatest emphasis was put on revival of Piotrkowska Street, a 4-kilometer-long artery, which constitute a historical center and showpiece of the city. However, the first years of the 21st century brought a crisis largely connected with the significant investments made in the immediate vicinity of the street. An important role was occupied, among others, by spectacular adaptation and revival of a part of the former post-factory complex of Israel Poznański, one of the two largest complexes of this kind created in 19th century Łódź. For over 100 years, the factory was a symbol of the power of Łódź industry. The huge 27-hectare complex located in the city center in the vicinity of Piotrkowska Street was transformed into a shopping and entertainment center and a hotel. The former waving mill from 1895 houses a branch of the Museum of Art in Łódź with the oldest permanent collection of avant-garde art in Europe, which interestingly was established in the industrial city. According to promotional materials, every year Manufaktura is visited by millions of people coming from different parts of the world. Indeed, it enjoys huge popularity. The transformation led to creation of a visually coherent architectural complex which has a unique character thanks to the peculiar aesthetics of the historic architecture. At the same time, however, in order to achieve an interesting form that to attract residents and visitors, it was subjected to a deliberate process of aesthetization and spectacularization. Also modernization and adaptation of a fragment of the former Israel Poznański's complex into a shopping center led to creation of new divisions which modified the historical composition. This possesses a trait that can be seen in the case of adaptive reuse of large architectural complexes, which due to the enormous cost of their conversion must be divided among various owners, both private and municipal ones. In the case of the two largest factory complexes in Łódź, Israel Poznański and Karol Scheiber's, conversion of some of the post-factory buildings undertaken by developers gave city authorities an impulse to take action in different, though not all, areas. In both cases, the city began, among others, the process of revival of a former workers' housing estate adjacent to the factories. Adaptive reuse and integrating structures from the past into the contemporary city life have become the only chance to prevent degradation and destruction of the buildings worthy of protection. Finding funds for restoration and modernization of so many historic buildings wouldn't have been possible without capital and private investment. At the same time, however, there's a danger of too far-reaching transformations stemming from current needs and benefits, and consequently, irreversible loss of historical values. Plus, a particular tension and possible conflict between authenticity and integrity of an object and its use and economic value. Nevertheless, although current commercialization and instrumental treatment of architectural heritage pose a significant threat, thanks to Polish transition from communism to democracy, various actions and solutions are now possible, despite market pressures and the prevailing fashion. It is particularly important to develop appropriate methods of public education concerning not only historical significance of architectural works, but also their social value, for example, associated with maintaining local bonds and identity. Adaptive reuse of architectural heritage is also a field of inevitable conflicts and clashing views. The issues concerning preservation and transformation of architectural heritage should not be monopolized by any party. It concerns not only developers or economists, but also city authorities, architects or conservators, and art historians who would mostly like to transform historical buildings into museums. It is extremely important to create a space for discussion and joint search for the best solutions that would enable preservation of architectural structures as a testimony to the past and at the same time leading them into the contemporary life of the city. Although developing a model for activities requires time and commitment, it is possible in a democratic system, unlike in the socialist times of central planning. Thank you very much for your attention.
Hello, all participants of this conference. As one of the speakers of this conference, I prepared a short presentation on the topic, political and economic changes in the world and Croatia in the 1990s. You can check the entire presentation through proceedings, and in this video I will only read the important parts of my presentation. My presentation consists of 3 parts. The first part covers changes and characteristics of the world political typography in the 1990s. In the second part, I want to talk about on the topic of globalization. And finally, in the third part, I look at Croatia's political and economic situation in the 1990s. Let us start with the first part of this presentation. During the last decade of the 20th century, the historical and political experiences of Croatia and the rest of the world, including Croatia, revealed a significant difference. Before examining Croatia's situation, let us first examine the changes in the global political landscape. From the end of the 1980s to the 1990s, the world experienced great geopolitical changes. In particular, the Eastern European socialist regimes started to decline one by one. People who were dissatisfied with the economic and cultural degeneration and government rhetoric that was both coercive and an illusion that maintained the system, formed a resistance against the socialist ideology itself. People from Eastern European countries poured into the streets, and Hungarian Prime Minister János Kádár, head of state of East Germany Erich Honecker, President of Bulgaria Todor Zhivkov, and head of the state of Romania Nicolae Ceausescu, who once maintained strong socialist regimes, were removed from power. After the socialist governments in Eastern European were overthrown, the political landscape changed to a majority party system, and the economy began to transition to a market economy system in Poland, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Romania. Finally, at the end of 1991, the most powerful and largest socialist state, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, went through a process of peaceful collapse, which was followed by the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact after World War II. This ended the Cold War, in which the United States of America and the USSR had fought over the political system and nuclear weapons management, and the global political bloc was dissolved. Since the 1990s, the world has been transformed into an era in which the logic of capital dominates instead of political ideology. This indicated the transition into an era dominated by human peace and development, as well as welfare and optimism for the future. After the 1990s, political ideologies underwent extreme changes, and the world's attention was focused on the topic of globalization. In other words, the world had gradually bridged the gaps between the nations through the development of technology and science, and was becoming integrated as one. However, globalization does not only mean global integration through changes in politics, systems, and ideology. U.S. multinational corporations such as Levi's and Nike move factories to the countries that can provide cheaper labor, and global companies such as Samsung Electronics and Hyundai Motors in Korea establish branches and factories abroad for the same reason. It could be said that all of them correspond to this concept of globalization. Cooperation between countries, regardless of distance, has become a matter of corporate survival rather than a matter of choice, which means the advent of the neoliberalism era in which political ideology is no longer important. In the capitalist economy, neoliberal ideas first attracted the countries of the former socialist bloc, followed by countries such as India, Mexico, and Vietnam. Thus, depending on the goal, neoliberal ideology is a strategy that leads to opening the market, the regulation of the government, various forms of corporate integration, and political concessions, spreading out into the former socialist bloc countries. It even brought China, the most abnormal socialist countries since the USSR, although there is an outlier, North Korea, into the international trade market, which is important for forming a new world economy order. Furthermore, the World Trade Organization, established in 1995, constituted the international customs system and legal system related to trade in goods, intellectual property, services, and so on, allowing the global economy to be controlled. The 1990s was also a time when unusual events occurred. In 1999, Kofi Annan, the 7th Secretary General of the United Nations, declared Adnan Mevich, born on October 12 in Sarajevo, Bosnia, the 6 billionth person on the planet. Of course, such a declaration is not more than a symbolic statement that has nothing to do with world demographics. In 2000, the last year of the 20th century, the Catholic Pope John Paul II visited Romania, making him the first Pope to visit an Eastern Orthodox country after the split between the Eastern and Western Roman churches. In the same year, U.S. President Bill Clinton became the first U.S. president to make a state visit to Vietnam. As such, the three events that occurred at the end of the 20th century, especially in 1999 and 2000, the years just before the transition of humankind into the 21st century, have a very special meaning in human history. At the end of the Cold War between the USA and the USSR, which dominated the world after World War II, a new world order was created that would bring peace to humankind instead of war that resurrected the history of death and confrontation. In addition, such a new world order could be said to include mutual understanding of religious differences until September 11th, 2001, the first year of the 21st century, when Islamic terrorist groups, including Osama bin Laden, the Al-Qaeda, attacked the World Trade Center and Pentagon, USA. In the 1990s, Croatia exhibited essential differences in all fields, independent of global dynamics. New technologies brought about the communication revolution. The world historical flow of human unity was created at the end of the Cold War, and various art fields were created by grafting new technologies. However, the Republic of Croatia experienced a period of struggle for independence from the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, which claimed to be the leading country in the Third World after World War II. In addition, the Republic of Croatia had to fight an exhausting, painful, and tragic war in the process of independence. It was also involved in the independence process of neighboring Bosnia-Herzegovina, thus revealing an essential difference from the changes in world history through the first half of the 1990s. Unlike countries such as Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Bulgaria, the USSR's satellite states that underwent a relatively peaceful transition in the 1990s, the Socialist Republic of Yugoslavia was disbanded through armed conflict. At the end of the 1980s, it was clear that the Yugoslav Federation was disintegrating to a point where it could no longer function properly, and Slobodan Milosevic was slowly taking over the real powers of the government. At the time, Milosevic was actively supported by the Serbian intelligentsia with the Serbian nationalist aspirations. In addition, most of the world's powerful countries, including Western Europe, strongly supported the preservation of Yugoslavia as a nation, turning a blind eye to the increasingly deteriorating political situation and events. Serbia's far-right politicians, led by Milosevic, continued to instigate the radicalization of their ethnic populations in Croatia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Kosovo, where Serbs were living. With the Yugoslav government facing a complete blockade, the first multi-party elections were held in the Republic of Croatia in the spring of the 1990s, in which the Croatian Democratic Union, Hrvatska Demokratska Zajednica, led by Franjo Tuđman, secured an overwhelming victory. Tuđman's Croatian Democratic Union was a far-right Croatian nationalist party whose top party goal was the independence of the Croatian people, and used that goal in its election campaign through fervent patriotic rhetoric. Milosevic of the Republic of Serbia, who climbed the political hierarchy while advocating far-right Serbian nationalism, and Tuđman of the Republic of Croatia, who came to power with far-right Croatian nationalism, inevitably created the conditions for an extreme confrontation. In the 1990s, when human history and culture were moving toward the communication revolution through the development of harmony, peace, and new technologies, the international community's perceptions of the war in Yugoslavia gradually changed. In the end, the 12 member countries of the European Union recognized Croatia's independence on January 15th, 1992, and the Vatican recognized Croatia's independence 2 days before the European Union's announcement. However, despite the official declaration and international recognition of independence in 1992, battles, large and small, to restore Croatia continued until the end of 1995. The traumatic experience of the war left a considerable mark on Croatians in the 1990s in every aspect of their lives. During the 1990s, Croatia achieved its status as an independent country, enduring many difficulties and sacrifices during the process, and it is very clear that war had the greatest impact. Consequently, Croatia's political and economic transition did not take place naturally like any other Eastern European countries. However, it has transformed into a complete democracy since the end of the Bosnian Civil War in 1995. Like other independent countries belonging to the former Yugoslavia, the Republic of Croatia, a new country that declared independence in 1991, Hwan, has established its own national identity differentiated from Serbia, claiming to be the successor of Yugoslavia after it declared independence, while other Eastern European countries continue to transition from a socialist system to a democratic system. Several events occurred in the former Yugoslavia during the 1990s. For example, Yugoslavia was dissolved and the War of Independence and Civil War broke out over the Republic of Bosnia and Herzegovina. For the new countries born from the former Yugoslavia, including Croatia, it can be said that the establishment of national identity, along with the process of transformation of the entire country's system, was an urgent task. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation. Despite the difficult COVID-19 situation, I hope everybody's health and happiness. Thank you very much.
The topic of my presentation today is Hungary's cultural sector after the political change. I will divide my presentation into 4 parts. Let's begin with the introduction. Many studies on the transition of a socialist regime had been conducted in Central and Eastern European countries. However, most studies focused on explaining the process after supposing the goal of a market economy in advance. As a result, insufficient attention was paid to functional factors such as non-market and subjective culture. Therefore, from this aspect, this article will analyze the post-socialist system transition in countries that have experienced the transition to the socialist system seen through the prism of culture. Central and Eastern European countries have been pursuing a transition to post-socialist regimes. The direction of reform that these countries are currently pursuing has the meaning of expanding exchanges in all fields, including economic cooperation, rather than simply introducing political and economic systems similar to those of Western European countries. This indicates that they are trying to restore their national identity as genuine members of Europe. Habermas defines the transition to post-socialist regimes in Central and Eastern European countries as a restorative revolution. And here the word restoration means that the countries rejoin the universal flow of democracy, human rights, and the establishment of a market economy. This article will seek to find the basis for claiming cultural homogeneity with Western Europe from a historical point of view. In addition, through Hungarian literature, how the characteristics of European culture are revealed in the transition to a post-socialist system, such as a political democratization, privatization, and the establishment of the ownership system, and the formation of a civil society will be discussed. In Hungarian literature, various trends and aspects appeared clearly. Empirical realism literary trends prevailed along with works mainly dealing with the confusion of consciousness of middle and lower aristocrats derived from the transition process to civil society and the difficulty of adapting to the capitalist economic system. And by the Austro-Hungarian dual monarchy system was forced and economy got stable. Subjective and personal literature became mainstream, alternative to racial problems and social problems. From the late 1880s, as people were awakened from the illusion of prosperity and stability, literature gradually gained certain social role and made social critical literature emerged in earnest. From the end of the 19th century to the beginning of the 20th century, various art trends such as Art Nouveau and avant-garde were reflected in the Hungarian literary world. The second part is Hungarian literature trend and aspects before system transformation. When retaliation against the Hungarian civic revolution and war of independence, which arose by resisting the rule of the Habsburg Empire, was carried out extensively, some of the Hungarian intellectuals, to which most of the writers belong, fled the country. Some were imprisoned, and most disappeared into the rural area. The mid-19th century was a period of literary decline in Hungary. Hungarian writers of that period set basis of their works on social and political ideas, which was becoming infertile. And Hungarian writers, who were mostly aristocrats, remained as a part of the middle class, and by the end of the century, writers from middle and lower classes came to the front. The Austro-Hungarian dual monarchy, born as a product of political compromise in 1967, transformed Hungary, an undeveloped agriculture country, into a rapidly developing agriculture and industrial country. The change in the Hungarian social structure, followed by rapid industrialization, has also brought about a significant shift in culture and art. From the end of the 19th century to the outbreak of First World War in 1914, Hungary, in the peaceful period of socio-economic and cultural prosperity, had a significant experience of changing its social system and style by accepting advanced Western European culture. Called as the Belle Epoque, the period was the most stable and peaceful in Hungarian history, when Austrian culture strongly influenced Hungarian culture. In broad framework, Hungarian culture in the era of the dual monarchy was not much different from traditional European culture, meaning that Hungary's cultural space was the interface of time and space that became European through contact with Austria. During this period, Hungary's culture in all fields, such as literature, performing arts, music, and art, aimed to be cosmopolitan beyond Hungary. Hungary, facing ongoing political crisis since 1905, eventually participated in the First World War due to its widespread nationality tendency, but became a defeated country. As a result of defeat, the Austro-Hungarian monarchy was disbanded, and many Hungarians, disappointed by the truce with their allies, pay attention to the Social Democratic Party and the Communist Party as political alternatives. Accordingly, many writers and artists profoundly reflected the idea of a communist revolution in their works with a sense of messianic propagation. However, writers who experienced the collective destruction after the First World War tried to overcome the complex social problems of time through various methodological searches by creating more vivid and social literature. Most of the writers who fled to foreign countries due to their radical socialist tendencies returned and began active work. However, writers who opposed the socialist transition were dissatisfied with the measures to restrict their work activities and left for exile to the West. At the end of the Second World War, Hungarian change appeared in literature as well as in other fields and society overall. Artists who fled to the West under oppression for being Jewish or uncooperative in the war returned to Hungary. In fact, except for a few writers who left for personal reasons, there were three massive political migration waves of Hungarian intellectuals to the West by the end of the Second World War. The first wave consists of those who refused to participate in the war under the wartime system between 1944 and 1945, those who were afraid to be persecuted, and those who could not accept the Soviet army had occupied. The second wave consists of those who lost hope for democratic changes in Hungary, which took place between 1947 and 1948. The third wave, the most significant and relatively high ratio of literary intellectuals, left right after the revolution of 1956 was suppressed. While the anti-revolution period, progressive communist writers who fled abroad have returned to Hungary, and Soviet literature was translated and published in Hungary in earnest. These progressive leftist writers resumed their literary activities, focusing on magazine publishing. Literature, which had fallen into a tool for representing political interests at the time, devoted itself to presenting a model for promoting and persuading socialist construction. As a result, socialist cultural policy took root, and Marxist aesthetics spread widely. On one side, the breakdown of the social class led to the rise of the working class and the spread of educational opportunities. On the other hand, free artistic activities could not be achieved by strict monitoring and supervising national cultural life. Writers and literary editors were silent due to restrictions and personal threats. Translating foreign literature or turning it to children's literature because the group of writers has disappeared, and many writers had to remain silent. One of the examples of the persons leading cultural policy by then was Joseph Levi. In 1949, Hungarian Writers' Union was formed. Almost all writers participated in this association, and during this period, many Hungarian literature researchers appeared and opened a new chapter in Hungarian literary criticism and literary historical research, which had been neglected until then. Social thoughts, vividly shown in literature, is a significant feature of Hungarian literature in the 20th century. For example, realism in the 19th century only exposed inequality and corruption in society, but had no idea about making a revolution happen. However, in the 20th century, the direction of this revolution became apparent, and literature based on the socialism-based revolution has emerged. At the same time, refuse and resistance to tradition were features of literature in the 20th century, and literature applying scientific analysis has also appeared. However, these tendencies captured from ideological viewpoint, and in terms of the form and style, it was incomparably full of confusion and division than earlier days. The third chapter is the trend and tendency of Hungarian literature during the transition period. János Kádár, who ruled as dictator from more than 30 years after the suppression of the revolution of 1956, pursued an emulsified form of communism, unlike Mátyás Rákos, who transferred Hungary into totalitarianism system. In addition to economic pluralization, the Hungarian Communist Party allowed the pluralization of society by acknowledging the conflict between the beginnings of various interests in society. However, Hungary's reform was suspended due to the Soviet Union's pressure in the early 1970s. Suspension of reform was jeopardizing Hungary's socio-economic foundation. Again, Hungary's Communist Party reformists created a second wave of reform. Hungary became the first communist country to introduce a multi-party system in 1989 from the one-party dictatorship, a way of communist dictatorship. It actively tried to innovate and open political, economic, and cultural fields. And after the transition of the system in 1989, oppression and surveillance of dissident literature activities gradually loosened. Literature finally returned to its original path. The parts culture policy didn't hold literary value in Hungarian literature. As the period of remarkable political change came, a large number of works which criticized the political system were released in Hungarian literature become able to be place itself in the flow of world literature. With the work of writers aiming for postmodernism reviving, writers made their work developed in various directions. Writers did not follow oppressive lines anymore, but wrote in free and diverse contents and forms. Hungarian cultural policy focused on restoring traditional culture before the communist system, reintroducing modern Western culture and promoting cultural art policy called arm's length principle, which meant government supports currently fields but no interferes. During that period, many types of writers, such as those who refused tradition and tried to find new ways to express in poetic expression, who tried new experimental works that reject traditional prose forms and languages, or who were obsessed with finding new languages against traditional language use and communication, have formed new literary trends. And like other countries, novels have become the main form of literary expression in Hungary. The literary division of the period is often closely related to political events. The 1989 political historical evolution in Hungary undoubtedly brought a major change in Hungary's literary community. There was no more pro-government cultural policy for the party and the state. Therefore, with the disappearance of the most important cultural policy, 3T, many writers unfamiliar to the younger generation of Hungary, including those who fled the country, were terminated from the band. As a result, interest in Hungarian literature abroad has become higher than ever, while various new literary magazines appeared before and after the regime change. Old pro-government magazines changed their stature and disappeared as their importance decreased. The fourth chapter is conclusion. In Budapest, which grew into the second capital of the dual monarchy in the late 19th century, a variety of newspapers and magazines were published. New publishers, theater, and academic organizations were made. High-level culture and artistic activities were busily developed. Since then, Hungary has formed its own national culture and entered into the cultural golden age. There was a significant influence from cultural and art trends in Germany and Austria at the end of the 19th century. From the early 20th century, British and French culture and arts had a significant influence. The period after 1945 was officially a period of socialist transformation, and many Hungarian writers were forced to remain silent due to the government's efforts to introduce socialist realism as the only creative way. And socialist realism was a significant literary value. But after the revolution of 1956, diverse works were published by critics or writers in a more accessible atmosphere. But after the revolution of 1956, the Hungarian literary circle became polarized. The writers who participated in the revolution were oppressed for criticizing the communist system. On the other hand, the reconstructed Writer Alliance positively led the socialists to praise literature. Until the mid-1960s, most of the efforts to strengthen the ideological purity of art were abandoned. For a long time, writers had to fight protracted war to gain mental freedom and freedom of creation. The Hungarian Communist Party has dealt with drastic reforms in every crisis. A radical economic reform by the Hungarian Communist Party, led by Gross-Károly, failed due to heightened dissatisfaction from the Hungarian public due to worsening Hungarian economic conditions, but has resulted in two meaningful and positive results underlying Hungarian transformation. First, reformative communists were appointed at the political bureau because reformists in party were strengthened. They led to playing a role in delivering the public's demands for democratization to the party leaders. Second, pressure for the public's political democratization had been raised by the permission of the wide range of freedom of speech and expression. With the advent of remarkable political change, the government's public censorship of the Hungarian literary circle has reduced. The possibility of free experiments has been raised, and writers could publish various works showing how modern novel techniques applied to Hungarian literature. And numerous anti-system works, which had been banned by then, were published and sought new literature by joining Hungarian literature to the world's literary trends. Writers developed in various directions as the movements of writers aiming for postmodernism gradually regained vitality. Writers could present works containing free and diverse contents and forms, not following the oppressing line. Thank you for your attention.
Hello everyone. My name is Teano. I'm senior researcher at East European and Balkan Institute, and I'm the organizer of this conference. I'd like to welcome you all here today. It's a little past 4:00 p.m. in Korea, and I'm going to start 2021 EEBI International Conference as we planned. Before starting the discussion, I want to inform you that our technical team is recording this session, and I will upload the video file on YouTube. So if there is no objection, we will continue to record it until we finish this session. Thank you for your understanding, and I'd like to express my gratitude to all participants who accepted my invitation and followed exactly the timeline of this conference schedule. I will introduce shortly every scholars who are attending this discussion session. First of all, I'd like to introduce Dr. Dennis Hart. Dr. Dennis Hart is the chair of this discussion session. Dr. Dennis Hart is former Associate Vice President at the University of Texas, Rio Grande Valley, And now he is CEO at Optimus International Education Consultancy. Please welcome him with a big applause. And here we have Dr. Balazs Varga. He is a professor at Eötvös Roland University in Hungary. And here we have Emma Pedestru. She is a PhD candidate at Babeș-Bolyai University. And here is we have Professor Roxana Cătălina Anghelescu. She is a professor at the Department of Romanian Studies. And Professor Hwan is a professor at the Department of Romanian Studies also. And Professor Kim Sang-hwan, professor at the Department of South Slavic Studies. And Dr. Kim Shin-gyu is a senior researcher at East European and Balkan Institute. And Dr. Lee Sang-dong is a senior researcher at East European and Balkan Institute also. And Professor Yeok Jin, she is a senior researcher at East European and Balkan Institute. And Professor Choi Sung-han at the Department of Polish Studies. And here we have Dr. Irina Genova. She is a professor at the New Bulgarian University. Please welcome her with a big applause. And here we have Dr. Julia Sowińska-Heim, professor at the University of Łódź. Please welcome her. And here we have Dr. Lee. She will help us for English-Korean translation. Now I will hand over a microphone to our chair of this session, to Dr. Dennis Hart.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ohm. Can everybody hear me all right?
Yes.
Good, good, good. Thank you all for attending, and thank you, Dr. Ohm, for the very warm introduction and for the conference that you're helping to host. Welcome. I would like to extend my personal welcomes to Cultural Change and Transition in Post-Communist Eastern Europe, Production and Consumption of Popular Art. I've watched the videos and seen your presentations, and I'm deeply impressed by the scholarship and by the ideas that are coming on this conference. So I'd like to thank you all for attending and contributing to this conference series. Particularly, I'd like to extend my gratitude to the East European and Balkan Centers, or Balkan Institute of Hamburg University of Foreign Studies, and its co-host, the Asian Association for Central and Eastern European Studies. But as we all know, organizations may support and give structure to events, but it's the people that make it possible. It is the people that turn a vision and an idea into a reality. So I would also like to express my special thanks to the following people. Dr. Kim Jong-hwan, the director of EEBI, thank you very much for hosting this. To Kim Sung-hwan, president of AAC-EES, thank you for co-hosting this important event. To Professor Žolt Lazar, University of Novi Sad, and our keynote speaker, thank you. I enjoyed reading and listening to your speech, and will enjoy it later in this session. Also, Dr. Myung-nae, who worked hard and is a skilled translator in helping making this conference possible. And to all the presenters and all the audience that I see on the screen, and all the faces, thank you for spending time with us here. I appreciate it very much. But my final thanks, my final appreciation goes to Dr. Tae-yeon. It is through his vision, his energy, and his determination that this conference series has come about. So would you please give a special round of applause to Dr. Tae-yeon for making this all possible. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Okay, so this year's conference, I have been fortunate to have been part of this series that's going on for a couple of years now. The conference series that is being put on by the EEBI and others is an ongoing and it's an ambitious project. It's a project that addresses one of the most fundamental, widespread, and important transformations in the last 30 years. Specifically, it's the shift in Eastern Europe away from a system in which people lived, thought, worked, and created their lives into an entirely new system in which they had virtually no experience and did not really know what to expect. This created challenges at all levels of life. What is particularly distinctive about this conference series is that it's not simply a string of ideas, but rather it is a logical sequence. It's a related themes in the series which tie together a very complex process being experienced by over 300 million people in Eastern Europe. We can see in the vision and the execution of this series a singular vision to help us all understand this complex process. This series and this conference in particular revolve around a straightforward yet difficult question. How have the diverse peoples in Eastern Europe guided change, redrawn national memories, authored new identities, and created new imaginings about themselves and their future? This is a mighty task. Last year's conference was titled Reinterpretation of Transformation and Transition of Eastern Europe, and it looked at the historical significance of Eastern Europeans' transformation, its distancing from Russia and the Soviet Union, and its reapproachment with Western Europe politically and economically. This year's conference is equally important, and in my mind even more so, in that it helps shed light upon a crucial aspect of Eastern European existence in history, its identities, its imaginings, and its creativities. What we're going to look at tonight, and what we've looked at over the last few days, is the production and consumption of popular art. So for me, this year's conference question, that which ties this all together, is how do people create identity, rework the fabric of their imaginations, and author new forms of identity during fundamental change that makes their entire previous life irrelevant to their future. That which people took for granted, who they are, how they work, what their ideals may be, have gone out the window, vanished 30 years ago. Now new imaginations and new identities are being summoned up. Here is the role for popular art. This conference gets to the root of a crucial human process, how we imagine ourselves and how we imagine the world in which we live. There is no more important medium for our imagining in this social process than the arts, particularly popular art in Eastern Europe. So, as all the scholars in their papers have shown us so far in this conference, it's through the arts, literature, cinema, architecture, music, whatever. It is through them that people collectively dream and collectively express their dreams for their lives and for their futures. An element that is essential for Eastern European as it moves forward into a bold, unknown future. What makes Eastern Europe so fascinating, and what I drew out of the papers and the scholarship that I see in this conference, is that within the span of a single lifetime, hundreds of millions of people in Eastern Europe departed from historical traditions. They lived under an externally imposed ideology of communism. They lost the only social system many people had ever known in their entire life in 1989. And then they embarked upon a new journey into a new world, a world in which virtually none of them had any experience or knowledge. That's an amazing time in human history. The identities of these hundreds of millions of people were anchored in their work, their everyday life, how they imagined the world. All of this shifted virtually overnight. What it meant to be a citizen of Poland, of Croatia, of Romania was no longer the socialist ideal. It was transformed. How are people to imagine their own identities and how to raise their children, how to express themselves? All the rules had changed. What we will see, and what the papers here demonstrate to me, is in Eastern Europe, the role of the arts is to provide people with new ways of seeing, new ways of thinking, and new ways of remembering what they were. This conference addresses how the artists and the people of Eastern Europe are guiding their future while remembering their past through popular art. So say what you want about the communist regimes, their lack of diverse thinking, but never doubt that the communist leaders had a belief in the arts. They believed that the arts play a fundamental role in shaping people's imaginations and thinking. This is why they went to great lengths to bend artists, to bend the arts, to channel it in particular directions, because they believe that this is how you control the mind and the imaginations of people. Communist Party knew to their core that the arts matter. That is why they tried to master them. Poorly, but they tried. But under communism, a prominent role of the arts was to keep the status quo. Now, there's a new role in Eastern Europe for the arts. It's not the status quo that's being maintained, being perpetuated, with imaginations being stifled. Honestly, now the arts are expected to lead change. And sometimes they're leading their people, their arts, and their nation into areas which may be hostile to the arts themselves in terms of funding. So what I gathered from all these papers is a wonderful set of ideas on how the people of Eastern Europe are reimagining themselves to create a new world. And it's the popular art that is guiding much of what's going on. So with that, I believe that I've used up my time, and I would like to open the floor to questions or comments from the audience, please. Oh, if I may ask one simple procedural question. Dr. Ohm, when the questions come up, will you be handling them? Did you hear me?
I want to handle the answering questions.
So you will handle them?
No, you handle the answering question.
Excellent. Just to clarify, thank you. If you have a question, simply raise your hand and ask your question, please. Yes, Dr. Genova.
Thank you. I'd like just to make a general comment until the questions arrived. I'd like to say that the presentations by all the conference participants were very stimulating for my research. As expected, there are many common features, but also quite a few differences in the circumstances and outcomes of transitions in my country and in other different situations. The common features synthesized by the plenary paper of Professor Lazar, Žolt from Novi Sad are a very good general terrain on which differences which could be discussed. Among the common places, also for the Bulgarian situation, I would like to point out to the changes, for instance, in the distribution of cinema. I'm not a specialist in this field, but the questions posed by our colleague Balazs Varga her thesis for the distribution of cinema as something very different after the changes in 1989 were very appealing for me because there are similarities in the Bulgarian situation too, and also the emergence of new generation and in Bulgarian cinema during the last decades, the last 10 years from now. In our cinema, there is also a kind of revival. The films are different and the perspectives are different. Here I mean for the report for the of Roxana, Cătălina, and Jeong, Hun KIM. So here also I found out some similarities. In one other case, the report of Julius Sowińska-Heim, the decline of architectural heritage in the first years after 1989, we have the same situation in the biggest cities in Bulgaria, but unlike the case of Lutz, I have been twice in Lutz, and it was the first time it was during the 1990s, and the second time it was after 2005, and I found out this enormous, huge difference in the appearance of this city. And unlike this situation, the difficulties with the decline of architectural heritage in the major Bulgarian cities is a perpetuating situation. Is still the case, unfortunately. So another thing which I could, another situation with which I could think in the perspective of the Bulgarian situation is the difficulties with the declining theater audience in the 90s. There are similar situation in Sofia, in Plovdiv, and other major cities and theaters in Bulgaria, and opera theaters also. So the conference is definitely a stimulus for my research work, and I would like to present the results of this conference after having the text in the institute, from which I am a part, the Institutes of Art Problems, and in my institute there are different sections of cinema and of theater, and my colleagues will be interested in the results of this conference, and that's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Genova. Does anybody else have any comments, thoughts, or questions?
I do have a question to Professor Kim Sang-hun. 교수님 질문 드리겠습니다. 1990년대 크로아티아를 비롯한 구유고 연방의 정치 사회적 상황은 내전으로 인해 다른 동유럽 국가들과는 차이가 있는데 현재 독립국인 크로아티아는 다른 구유고 연방 국가들보다 더 긍정적으로 보입니다. 그 이유에 대해서 궁금합니다.
통역해 주시는 거죠?
네.
네, 감사합니다.
네, 저기
네. The political and
유명인
social
좀
conditions.
번역을 좀 해주세요.
네. The political and social conditions. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Please unmute. We
I'm
cannot
not
hear you.
hearing you, Dr. Om. Is your mute on?
I think it automatically muted. Just I apologize. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay.
예, 잘 들립니다.
I apologize. Okay, the political and social conditions in Croatia and other members of the former Federal Republic of Yugoslavia are different from those in other Eastern European countries because of the civil war. It seems that Croatia, as an independent country now, seems to be doing better than other members. What do you think is the reason for this positive outlook of Croatia?
네, 제가 영어가 짧아서
네.
한국어로 답변을 드리도록 하겠습니다. 일단 먼저 제 소개를 잠깐 드리면, 저는 세르비아 크로아티아과 교수고요. 문학 전공입니다. 그래서 이 프로젝트를 중간중간에 끊어야 되죠? 엄 선생님.
제가 받아 적을 테니까
네네.
말씀해 주세요.
이 프로젝트를 하면서 많이 배우기도 하고 새로운 것들을 그렇게 했는데요. 제가 1990년대에 지금 방금 학생이 질문한 내용과 관련해서 논문을 써서 논문을 썼습니다. 근데 그 내용이 뭐냐면 지금 현재 상황에서 보면 소위 중부 유럽이라고 하는 폴란드, 헝가리, 체코 라는 그 국가들하고 발칸 반도에 위치해 있는 국가들, 그러니까 유고 연방에 속해 있는 국가들 포함해서 불가리아, 루마니아 다 포함이 되겠죠. 그런 국가들하고 경제적인 면에서 차이가 많이 나는데, 실질적으로 1990년대에 현지에서 유학을 하면서 상황을 봤을 때는 그다지 큰 차이가 없었거든요. 발칸반도 국가들하고 폴란드, 헝가리, 체코가 큰 차이가 없었는데도 불구하고 지금 현재 상황에서 놓고 보면 차이가 난다, 그런 것을 알 수가 있습니다. 그런 차이가 저는 정치적인 면에서는 큰 차이가 없다고 생각을 해요. 지금 현재 상황에서 보면. 근데 경제적인 부분에서는 차이가 분명하게 나고 있는데, 그것이 왜 그러냐. 구유고, 크로아티아를 포함한 구유고의 상황만을 놓고 보면 1990년대에 유고슬라비아 사회주의 연방공화국이 해체가 되는 과정에서 유고슬라비아는 굉장히 공화국들 간의 어떤 무역을 통한 그런 체제 전환, 국가가 해체되고 체제가 전환되는 그런 상황을 맞았던 것이 거의 10년 가까운 시간 동안 지속이 되었던 것이 지금 현재의 경제적인 차이를 낳고 있는 것이 아니냐라는 생각이 들고 있고요. 반면에 2000년대가 들어오면서부터는 구유고 연방 내에서도 경제적인 차이가 눈에 띄게 두드러진 면이 공화국별로 나타나고 독립국가가 된 공화국별로 나타나는데 그게 이제 슬로베니아 그 논문에서는 다루지 않았지만 슬로베니아와 크로아티아라는 그 두 개 국가하고 나머지 국가들 그러니까 보스니아, 세르비아, 몬테네그로, 마케도니아 같은 나라들하고 또 그 안에서 그 유고 연방 안에서 차이가 나게 되는데 그 이유는 제가 3차년 논문을 마쳤는데 그 차이를 보면 2000년대 그 10년 동안의 기간을 지나면서 슬로베니아와 크로아티아 같은 경우에는 그 구시대에 대한 청산, 그러니까 그 사회주의에 대한 청산이 보다 더 적극적으로 일어난 측면이 있습니다. 그래서 그런 그 사회주의 청산뿐만이 아니라 1990년대에 그 경제적인 후퇴를 가져왔었던 유고 내전의 그런 그 역사를 서유럽 국가들, 그러니까 서방 국가들, 미국을 포함한 서방 국가들이 요구하는 대로 따랐던 측면 때문에 크로아티아와 슬로베니아는 좀 더 구유고 연방 내에서 좀 더 앞설 수 있었던 그런 상황인 것처럼 보이고, 그러니까 그런 그 노력들을 했기 때문에 2013년에 크로아티아 같은 경우에 7월 1일자로 이제 그 유럽연합 회원국으로 가입을 하거든요. 그래서 2000년대 그 10년이 만들어낸 차이점이 구유고 연방 내에서도 또 다른 그런 그 국가 간의 차이를 만들어내는 것이 아닌가라는 생각이 듭니다.
Okay. Professor Kim Hwan studied in former Yugoslavian Federation in 1990s. Is that right? And he specialization is Croatian literature. And he wrote in 1990s a paper on the exact topic that the student raised, the difference among the countries within the Federation of the Yugoslavia. But currently there are some differences emerging among Eastern European countries between the Middle Eastern European countries, which include Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and so on, versus the Balkan countries, including Romania and Bulgaria, and so on. But according to Professor Kim Hwan, in the 1990s, they were not that different. The difference didn't really emerge until recently. But in the after 2000, during the 10-year period of year 2000s, the difference began emerging. And he sees it not as a political reason, but an economic difference. Political systems are quite similar between among the countries, but economically there was a big difference. Why is that so? Because after the Yugoslavia split up in the federation split up, the different countries, the members of the former federation took a different path. So in 2000, after the 2000s, Slovenia and Croatia kind of went ahead as opposed to Bosnia and Montenegro and other members. And he believes that the reason is economically they followed the demands and the model of Western Europe and the Western forces. And and they cleaned up and removed quite a bit of the communist legacy during that period. And he believes that that's the reason why we begin to see such a big difference. I hope I did the justice to to what he wrote. Is a complex answer.
Thank you all very much. So the floor once again is open for other questions or comments.
I do have another question, and I'm so sorry that I forgot to introduce myself. I work in Eastern Balkan European Institute as research assistant. This time I have a question to Professor Kim Hwan. I will ask in Korean. 교수님 질문 드리겠습니다. 루마니아 영화의 성공과 뉴웨이브에 중요한 기여를 한 영화로 4개월, 3주, 그리고 2일이 있습니다. 이 영화의 주제와 의미에 대해서 말씀해 주시면 고맙겠습니다.
The movie titled 4 months, 3 weeks, and 2 days is considered to have made an important contribution to the success of Romanian cinema in general and to the new wave. Could you please tell us more about the theme and the significance of this movie?
For the discussion, my co-operator, Ms. Professor Roxana Anghelescu, will answer. So, yeah, please.
Good afternoon, everybody, or good morning or good evening. First of all, thank you so much for having me today. I'm very honored to meet you. It's a very interesting experience to me. And for these questions, yes, I would like to just say a couple of words about the movie, like 4 months, 3 weeks, and 2 days. Definitely, this movie is an important step forward the development of the Romanian cinema. It's not only about the structure or how the movie was made, but also it's about the subject of the movie. The movie describes in an extremely accurate way the everyday life of Romanians during the last years of the most terrible regime in Eastern Europe. Watching this movie together with Professor Kim, I was like just remembering my childhood and teenage, because I was a teenager in the last couple of years of the 1980s. And it was so shocking for me because it's not just a movie. For me, it's more like a documentary because it's so real. It's brutal real, and it showed how just normal people used to live in those dark days of Ceausescu regime. Even though the word communism was not pronounced, not even once during the movie, you can feel that people were afraid of talking. So silence is another subject of the movie. People, they just talk only what they have to say, but if possible, they pretend like nothing happened. And the subject of the movie is the story of 2 girls who set up on illegal abortion, brings to light another terrible condition in which Romanians had to live, a country where the human rights were non-existing under the dictatorship of Ceausescu. The abortion ban, which was issued in 1967, gives another perspective of how Romanians used to live. It gives another perspective of the Romanian women's life during those days when any kind of illegal abortion was punished, tortured, and even the doctors were imprisoned and used to be named like serial killers. However, the movie, it doesn't ask the viewers about an agreement or disagreement about abortion, in my opinion. In fact, it's just asks and various thoughts about the control social system, the sexual exploitation and abuse. It talks about the dignity of humans, the infringement upon personal rights, and other problems which the prevention of abortion creates. And through this subject, the prevention of abortion by communist dictatorship, the film director Moon accused, in my opinion, the human life and rights were under the control of a social and communist system. So it's more than just a message. It's not only about the abortion subject, but it's showing very different aspects of Romanian people. I mean, you can see during the movie that everything, the atmosphere was very dark. People were staying in line to buy like sugar or whatever or other stuff. But also like people were like frightened. They show the difference between like intellectual, how the intellectual live and the difference with the simple people. It show the campus life and how the students used to live. It's the film. It's so real that it made me remember and feel like I was just living, like 20 years ago while I was a student. So, in other words, it shows the Romanian life under a regime that gave no rights and no freedom to its people. And I hope I answer your question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a very interesting talk on the movie. I will have to rent it and have to see it after listening to that to learn more. So,
Yes.
does anybody else
Thank you.
have questions or comments?
My name is Yeon-seo. I am a research assistant in EEBI. 이상동 교수님께 질문 드리겠습니다. 1989년 이후 동유럽 국가들이 탈사회주의 체제 전환 과정에서 추진했던 대안적 제도의 선택이 자유민주주의와 시장경제, 정치적, 경제적 측면에서 사회주의를 벗어나 자본주의로, 그리고 공산주의를 벗어나 민주주의로의 체제 전환이었다면 헝가리 문학적 측면에서의 대안적 제도의 선택은 무엇인지 궁금합니다.
Okay, this is the question to Professor Lee Sang-dong. The alternative systems that Eastern European countries adopted during the post-communist era after 1989 was market economy and liberal democracy. In other words, the transition was from socialism to capitalism and communism to democracy. But from the perspective of Hungarian literature, what does it mean to choose alternative institutions?
네, 저도 일단 한국어로 답변을 드리겠고요. 통역 요청을 좀 드리겠습니다.
네.
그러니까 보통 지금 동유럽 국가들의 탈사회주의 체제 전환 과정에서 자유민주주의와 시장 경제, 정치적, 경제적 측면에서 이 트랜지션이라는 표현을 많이 사용하고 있는데, 헝가리 문화 분야에서 이렇게 자유민주주의라든가 시장 경제와 같은 어떤 대안적 제도를 물어보신다면 그 대안적 제도가 이렇게 자유민주주의다, 시장 경제다라고 딱 답변을 드릴 수는 없지만 적어도 헝가리 문화 분야에서는 트랜지션보다는 하버마스가 표현했던 것처럼 레스토레이션이라는 단어가 더 적합하지 않을까 모르겠습니다. 이걸 한국어로 옮길 때 전환, 복귀 또는 반환 또는 복원, 복구 여러 가지 이렇게 의미가 또 나올 수도 있는데 왜 이런 표현을 썼냐면요. 89년이 굉장히 큰 의미가 있는 건 맞습니다. 헝가리 국민들의 요구에 따라서 1989년 공산 독재 정치 방식이 일당 독재에서 옥수정장 제도를 도입하면서 정치 경제뿐만 아니라 헝가리 문화 각 분야에서도 개혁과 개방을 활발히 추진하는 그런 운동이 가속화돼서 더 빠르게 진행된 건 맞지만 저는 89년보다는 헝가리의 민중봉기, 1956년 혁명을 더 중요한 기점으로 보고 싶습니다. 왜 그러냐면 50년 이전에 이미 헝가리는 오스트리아 헝가리안 듀얼 모나키라고 해서 보통 한국에서는 오스트리아 헝가리 이중제국이라고 얘기를 합니다. 오스트리아 헝가리 이중제국을 통해서 후진적 농업 국가였던 그런 헝가리가 굉장히 빠른 속도로 발전을 합니다. 그래서 그런 급속한 산업화 과정을 통해서 사회 구조뿐만 아니라 헝가리 문화예술 분야에서도 굉장히 커다란 그런 변화가 나타나게 됩니다. 그래서 19세기 말부터 1914년 제1차 세계대전이 발발하기 전까지 정말 사회, 경제, 문화적으로 굉장히 번성했던 그런 시기라고 말할 수 있는데, 그러니까 이 시기에 헝가리는 서구의 문물을 받아들이면서 사회 체제뿐만 아니라 이런 문화 모든 분야에 있어서 중대한 경험을 하는데, 아무튼 오스트리아의 문화가 헝가리 문화에 강한 영향을 끼쳤던 그런 기간이라고 얘기를 할 수가 있어요. 그래서 이중제국 시대의 헝가리 문화는 전통적인 유럽의 문화와 크게 다를 바가 없다. 그러다가 이제 물론 제1차 세계대전을 기점으로 해서 세계대전에서 패전한 이후에 헝가리 국내에 헝가리 사람들이 어떤 정치적인 대안으로서 사회민주당, 공산당 이런 곳에 주목한 거는 있지만, 그리고 이제 제2차 세계대전이 끝나면서 이제 공산주의가 정착되긴 했지만, 헝가리에서 그런 1950년도에 자유화를 부르짖었던 그 민주혁명은요, 헝가리 사회에 굉장히 다원화를 허용하는 어떤 계기가 됐기 때문에 50년 혁명 이후에 경제 문화 분야에서의 이런 부분적인 거긴 하지만 자유화를 허용을 했었고, 또 온건한 그런 개혁 정책을 추진하면서 특히 이 자유를 갈망하는 헝가리 시민들의 어떤 욕구를 무시할 수 없었기 때문에 부분적이긴 하지만 적극적으로 서유럽 문화에 대한 문화 개방 정책들을 이렇게 실시를 하게 됩니다. 그것이 더 중요한 기점이었기 때문에 저는 오히려 트랜지션이라는 표현보다는 레스토레이션이라는 표현이 헝가리 문화 분야에서는 더 적합하지 않을까라고 생각해서, 아직 정확하게 질문자께서 요구하신 것처럼 자유민주주의, 시장경제 이런 식의 표현은 드릴 수는 없지만 답변이 되는지 모르겠습니다. 네.
Professor Lee's response to is the transition. It is the term that is used to describe to the transition to the liberal political and capitalist economical systems. But in his mind, what is more important to Hungarian, the current, contemporary Hungarian social system is not 1989, but the revolution in 1956. Hungary has actually a very interesting history of modernization. During the dual monarchy time, before the 19th century, Hungary was the backwards agricultural country. Then there was a massive movement of modernization toward the end of 19th century, in the 19th century until the World War I. So what happened was that Hungary was under great Western European influence of Western European civilization, and they were particularly very highly affected by Austrian culture. And the social systems and cultures were actually very similar to Western Europe back then. But after World War II, Hungary became a communist country. But during the 1956, the civic revolution, after that, the government allowed diversification, and there was quite a bit of liberalization inside the country, because the state responded to the civic society's demands for freedom. So in his mind, the post 89 changes in Hungarian culture and society, he would like to call restoration rather than transition, because the Hungarian people have this strong memory, the historical memory of 1956. And in his mind, it is the Habermasian term of restoration. Okay. Thank you.
And thank you and all others. So, questions or comments, please. The floor is open.
Hi, my name is Yi Ji-hu. I'm a researcher at Balkan Institute in Eastern Europe. 엠마 페데스트루 교수님께 질문드립니다. 차우체스쿠가 통치하던 공산주의 시기와 체제 전환을 거친 현재 루마니아 국장에 대한 프로시딩을 읽었습니다. 저는 공산주의 시기 국가가 문화와 예술에 대해 검열, 통제 계획했다고 들었고, 또 당시의 문화와 예술은 국가와 사회주의에 봉사하는 일종의 사회주의 리얼리즘을 지향했다고 알고 있습니다. 그러나 한편에서는 공산주의 시기에도 문화 예술계에 자유롭고 창조적인 정신이 많이 남아있다고 생각합니다. 그래서 두 가지 궁금한 점이 있어서 질문드립니다. 먼저 첫 번째는 루마니아 시에러의 새로운 변신을 설명해 주셨는데 이런 현상은 인접한 다른 중동부 유럽 국가에서의 상황과 비슷한 것 같습니다. 그럼에도 다른 국가와는 다른 루마니아만의 독특한 특징이 있었나요? 그리고 두 번째 질문으로는 정치적 변화 전후에 문화 예술계의 외형적인 변화 외에도 어떤 내면적인 변화가 있었는지 알고 싶습니다.
Okay, this is the question to Professor Emma Pedestru. Pedestru, I'm sorry. She said she enjoyed her presentation on the Romanian theater very much during the communist era under Ceausescu and the current post-transition society. She learned that communist state censored, controlled, and planned culture and art, and the culture and art in that time period was mostly based on socialist realism and served the state and the socialist ideals. However, she still suspected there was some free and creative spirit in the world of art and culture even in that period. So she has two questions about it. First, the changes in the Romanian theater seems to be similar to those in nearby Middle Eastern European countries, but were there any distinctive features in the transition in Romanian theater that was not found in other countries? Second, were there any internal changes in the culture and art aside from the external changes since the transition?
I think Professor Emma Pedestru has a little problem in internet connection, so we are moving to next question and then we call her later.
Okay.
I have a question for Balazs Varga. 발표문에서 제시하신 세 가지 가설이 아주 흥미로웠고, 특히 1980년대 사회주의 시기의 영화 산업이 체제 전환 이후보다 더욱더 시장 지향적이었다는 사실에 놀랐습니다. 또한 정치적 변화가 다른 모든 분야의 전환을 동시에 유도한 것이 아니라는 설명도 흥미로웠습니다. 저는 그루무 선데이 선 오브 라울 등의 헝가리 영화를 보았는데요. 대부분 2차 대전과 관련된 영화여서 다른 내용의 영화도 보고 싶다는 생각을 하게 되었습니다. 여기서 한 가지 질문을 하자면 발표자님께서 헝가리 영화가 글로벌 시장에서 성공할 가능성이 있는지, 그리고 그렇게 되기 위해서는 어떤 발전이 필요하다고 생각하시는지 궁금합니다.
Okay. This is the question to Professor Varga. Thank you for your presentation on the changes in Hungarian films since the transition. The three hypotheses you presented were very interesting. It surprised me that the film industry in the 1980s during the socialist period was even more market-oriented than now. Also, it was interesting to know that the political changes did not lead the changes in all other areas at the same time. I watched the Hungarian films such as Gloomy Sunday and The Son of Saul, but most of them were about World War II, and I would like to watch different kinds of films. My question to you is, how successful do you expect Hungarian films will be in the global market? And what would it take for Hungarian films to do well, to be successful in the global market?
So, okay, thank you, the comments and the questions. Well, as for global market, I would like to begin with a remark which might refer back to previous comments. Because although now we focus on the political changes and the transformation in Eastern Europe, I think we have to bear in mind that those transformations in Europe and the fall of the Soviet bloc happened in parallel with important political changes in Korea, in Asia, and in Latin America. And the broader context of those post-Cold War changes was a kind of globalization and the crucial economic and political changes almost all over the world. So, that's what I just had a small remark in my presentation, that I think an important context of the Hungarian or Eastern European political changes is the changing cultural and globalization process, with stressing the importance of the audiovisual changes like satellite television, television commerce without political restrictions. So I think that from the 90s on, it's not only Eastern Europe but Latin America and South Asian countries and film cultures which faced with new challenges and new opportunities, as the thanks to the integration in film industry and thanks to the cultural globalization, the markets and the canons are opened up. So I think, and that might be interesting because we can mention at least 3 different examples. Hungarian and Eastern European film cultures, I'm referring to Polish, Czech, or Hungarian film cultures, which were somehow known for the Western audience earlier, I mean, from the 60s, had some traditions and visibility for the Western markets. We have already mentioned new Romanian cinema and Munju's film. New Romanian cinema around the new millennium was a kind of breakthrough, and an important part of that breakthrough was the lacking visibility of Romanian films before the political changes. We can mention a few important directors like Pintili and so on, but new Romanian cinema had the advantage of presenting something which is considered somehow completely new. And though speaking of the political changes, and the third example might be, again, somehow in connection with the globalization, might be the Korean transformation. And I think the transformation of the Korean film industry, Korean cinema, or the Hallyu wave, again, something which began with the political changes, which began with strong roots and boom in the local, regional culture, and hitting the global
stage. So I think these are three quite different models. The Hungarian or the Central European model is the connection and tradition in high culture. The Romanian miracle, the new cinema, presents something of a kind of breakthrough without visible traditions. And the Korean, say, breakthrough is a kind of organic building up, starting from the local and popular film industry and changing and hitting the global screens, say.
Thank you very much. Other questions or comments?
이리나 제노바 교수님께 질문드립니다. 체제 전환을 전후한 불가리아 아동서적에 대한 설명 잘 들었습니다. 아동서적도 하나의 상품으로 시장에서 경쟁해야 하고 아직은 기술적인 측면에서 경쟁력이 떨어지지만 앞으로 세계 시장에서 경쟁해야 한다는 점도 예상할 수 있었습니다. 저는 아동서적이 상품이기도 하지만 불가리아의 고유한 문화의 일부라고 생각합니다. 따라서 체제 전환 이후의 경쟁은 단순히 사파나 인쇄 등의 기술적인 경쟁보다는 독특하고 창조적인 콘텐츠와 같은 문화의 경쟁이 될 것이라고 생각합니다. 그래서 문화로서 불가리아 아동서적이 어떤 경쟁력을 지니고 있는지 질문드리고 싶습니다. 한국에서도 많은 불가리아 문학과 아동 문학을 접할 수 있기를 기대합니다.
This is a question to Professor Genova. I enjoyed the presentation on children's literature in Bulgaria during the transition. I understand that children's literature is also a commodity that needs to compete in the market, but that although Bulgarian industry of children's literature is not yet mature in the technological aspect, it will compete in the global market in the future. I believe the children's books are not only forms of commodity, but also a part of Bulgarian culture, and that competition in the post-transition market will depend on cultural assets such as unique and creative content, rather than technological aspects such as illustration or printing. I'm curious that what kind of competitive merits Bulgarian children's books have as a cultural product. Lastly, I would like to see Bulgarian literature, including children's literature, become available in Korea.
Thank you for the question and for the comments. Actually, this is not a simple question. In Bulgaria, the children's book and literature has a long tradition. Before the World War II, in the 20s, after the First World War, a large amount of children's book supported by the Ministry of Culture and by the state as a whole in the 20s were edited and issued, and along with that many articles on the importance of children books for the education of children and for the education of aesthetic views since the early age was edited too, not only by artistic critics, but also for critics of literature. So this is this was a moment in the 1920s in which the Bulgarian children's book has been commented as a national problem and a national value. And at this moment, they happened very very good correspondences between artists and writers in the field of this specific book for children and adolescents. So there is a kind of tradition in this field, and then after the Second World War, it was again a problem of state importance, let's say, especially at the end of the 50s and the beginning of the 60s. This time it was in a completely different situation when the book issues and matters were monopolized by the state. And we could see that it was not only a question of children's education, but also of a special kind and of ideological education and ideological values. But not the whole terrain was the ideology didn't have impact on the whole terrain of the children's book, and here we could find a very good artists and translators especially find a very good path of escape from the ideology in the translation and edition of foreign books. In my presentation, I mentioned that there is not such a literature, such an important literature from these times, the children's stories, I mean, that could be interested. The Bulgarian language is a small language, and there are not a very good translator from Bulgarian to other languages. The inverse, from the inverse side, we have really brilliant translators, but from Bulgarian to big languages, it was not the case, and it was one of the obstacles for selling Bulgarian children's book to the open market. Since the 1960s and 1980s, the market problem and I could say that like in the film industry, in the book industry, the situation, external situation, so the presentation of Bulgarian books on the market was more opened, much more in the 80s than it was the case in the 60s. But nevertheless, it was not big successes in the selling of Bulgarian literature outside. Instead of this, during the 80s and after the changes, Bulgarian artists managed and could sign contracts as illustrators and book designers for other or for international edition house. But here I could say that similarly to the situation in the film production, the book production, as we all know, nowadays happen in international book houses, and the production of children's book is not does not happen or very rarely in national frame. And I try to show examples of let's say kind of cooperation in the field of translation of interesting children's book from other languages, from Italian, from German and English, for instance, and editing all those literature pieces, editing with the illustration of Bulgarian illustrators, not only in Bulgarian but also in other languages. So I don't think that in the field of children literature or I don't know, or in cinema, for instance, we could think the whole endeavor in the national frames in this global situation. Yes, I don't know if I answer to your question.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Genova. Now, we have a question already waiting for Dr. Pedestru. So, if you would, Dr.
Since we lost the connection briefly, so I will ask the question again to Dr. Pedestru. I'm sorry. I enjoyed your presentation on the Romanian theater during the communist era under Ceausescu and the current post-transition society. I learned that communist state censored, controlled, and planned culture and art, and the culture and art in that time period were mostly based on socialist realism and served the state purpose and socialist ideals. However, I still suspect that there was some free and creative spirit in the world of art and culture, even in that period. I have two questions about it. First, the changes in the Romanian theater seems to be similar to those in nearby Middle Eastern European countries. Were there any distinctive features in the transition in Romania that was not found in other countries? Second, were there any internal changes in the culture and art world aside from the external changes since the transition?
Yes, first, I think when it comes to theater, the situation is a bit different because unlike, I think cinema could be subjected to a much worse form of censorship, but theater allowed for some sort of I don't know, I wouldn't call it dissidence, but some sort of subversive discourse because of the nature of the art, and that made it quite popular during the 80s when everything was, as you can imagine, very strictly controlled. So in the 1990s, at the beginning of the after the revolution, theater lost this advantage. It was at first it lost its public, it lost its relevance. So in the first years after the revolution, it was a fight for regaining that lost relevance for the public, to regain its public. First of all, in Romania, I don't know how the situation was in other countries from the Eastern Bloc in this respective, but Romanians after the revolution were quite enchanted with everything that came from the West. I remember stories from family and people. I was very small then, but even food and things that they had here, but everything that came from the West was considered much better, was considered much more precious because of the trauma of not having access to any of these alternatives. So when it comes to theater, it happened the same. I think people thought, theater makers and theater directors thought that a savior figure could only come from the outside. So they sort of welcomed these directors that had left the country during the old regime. And it's very interesting because the most important event after 1989 in Romanian theater was Andrei Șerban's trilogy. And I think it's relevant from this perspective that it was a remake of a performance that was made in the 70s in the US. And it was remade subsequently in France, I think. And so it was something that Romanians considered revolutionary, that Romanians considered ground-shaking, and it brought the public back because it was from the outside. Because and it even now, after all these years, critical papers still record this event as the new beginning, as the founding of contemporary theater in Romania. So this is, I don't know if it's distinct or it's a particularity of the Romanian case, but this is how things were in that time period. We somehow looked at outside the borders for some sort of for a messianic figure, actually, for someone who would come and teach us how to do things, how to make art and theater in particular. I don't know what the second part of the question was. I'm sorry.
Second part of the question was there any internal changes inside the world of the theater in Romania after the transition?
Yes, of course there were. First of all in communist Romania, playwrights had a kind of a privileged situation. So because being a playwright was very good for an intellectual, because if you studied and became a teacher, for example, you had to leave your city, your town, your birthplace. You were I don't know how to say it. You were sent away in another by the system, by a system that okay, and this happened if you studied to become a doctor. This happened if you studied to become an engineer. You had no guarantee that you would go where you wanted to go. You would stay where you wanted to stay. But being a writer and a playwright had this advantage that you could live anywhere. You could go to the premieres. If you had the luck to have your plays performed, you are kind of a small star in this universe, and you had some sort of freedom. well, after 1990, after 1989, actually, this whole thing collapsed. This whole system collapsed, and all these people. I wrote in my paper about a small group that was formed by these playwrights that were suddenly without purpose. They were suddenly ignored by the theater makers. They had formed a small group that was called Dragon. And in Romania, it comes from dramaturgi, goniți. You can't find very much about it, but there are mentions in period articles and reviews, and in the beginning of the 90s, they even tried to get a theater for themselves. They went to Andrei Pleșu, who was Minister of Culture at the time, and asked for the Odeon Theater for themselves, but the person who was in charge with the theater at that moment refused. So they were very close to getting that. They made some effort, but other than that, they were left without any purpose. And I think this was one of the biggest changes, because we had this system of that worked before 1989, where these people had some sort of power, and then we have this I don't know how to say, enthusiasm towards everything that came from the outside, towards the directors. A new generation of directors rose after that. Some of Romania's best theater performances were done during that period not only by those directors that came from the West, but also from very young ones who, not very young, but young ones who had not been compromised, so found themselves in compromised positions during the communist era. So yes, I think people changed, and methods of work changed. We were exposed to a different system, to a different, and it wasn't always looked at as a good thing. I mean, Andrei Șerban was criticized by the actors because he insisted that they worked more. He insisted that they had a certain discipline that they weren't necessarily used to before he arrived before he became a manager. And also there's this Alexandru Hausvater had made a performance, directed a performance that was called The Handcuffed Flowers at the Odeon Theater, and a member of the parliament at that moment wrote an anonymous letter of protest because there were nude scenes, because there were yes, because they were vulgar, and it was a very difficult change to ingest, actually, but it was also radical, and it shook the foundation, and it completely changed the way people looked at the theater, I think. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And with that, I believe that we are running short on time. So I want to thank you all. It was wonderful to read your papers and to learn what's going on with popular art and the potential it has and the role that it's playing. I also want to thank all the people who organized this conference and Dr. Omyongne for her wonderful translations, which is a difficult thing to do on the spot, and for Dr. Tae-yeon, who organized this and behind the scenes put in great energy. So thank you all. And with that, I turn it over to Dr. To wrap it up. Thank you all.
I wish you a Merry Christmas, which will come soon. And in the name of the Institute, I want to express again our gratitude to all participants. I want to continue our academic relations. Thank you very much.